Welcome to chapter 7 of Wuthering Heights. The mood lighting is thanks to the weather outside. I'm just rolling with it, and I think it's kind of fitting since this is a gothic. But it is also fitting because I am filming this in the month of December, and as we will see with the first line of chapter 7, this chapter takes place around Christmas time. As the first line says, Kathy stayed at Freshcross Grange 5 weeks, till Christmas. By that time, her ankle was thoroughly cured and her manners much improved. And it's the second line that I want to focus on right now. The by the time her ankle thoroughly cured and her manners much improved. Ankle cured. So you know that her ankle was broken. And my brain immediately went to the connection of the two. Her ankle was broken, and then it seems in my head that they tried to her, break her of her free will and free spirit as you might break a horse, kind of. And it's because we're seeing Kathy going from a wild, their definition, wild girl with her own kind of strong spirit and free will to then becoming the image, at least, of what society expects young ladies to look like. And we see it's all very surface level, very a facade. It's an act because, as we will see deep down underneath this facade, underneath this mask, her spirit's still there. It's just been dimmed. It's kind of like a flame now being covered by a kind of like ceramic jar or a mask. Like it's prettier now, the flame in the ceramic jar, but it's being smothered. It's dimmer than it was when it was left open to be free, if that makes sense. And we're going to see now this change from Kathy accepting society because she does, because she's so free. Unless, like, I don't know, I have to reread this chapter. It's been so many years because now I'm like wondering, like, she was kind of trapped with a broken ankle in Fresh Cross Grange. Did they break her in her spirit in a strong willed way? Did they kind of gaslight and Stockholm Syndrome esque change her in that manner? Or did she willingly step towards this, seeing the luxury and the coddling she could have in return? Was it worth dimming her spirit? So let's continue this chapter and see. Moving on to the next sentence, we have the mistress visited her often in the interval and commenced her plan of reform by trying to raise her self-respect with fine clothes and flattery, which she took readily. Now the sentence continues because Emily Bronte loves a semicolon, but focusing on this first bit, the mistress that Nellie is referring to is Hindley's wife. So thus far, we have not learned her first name. She has just been referred to as the mistress or Hindley's wife, which makes Emily Bronte extremely brilliant, in my opinion, in the subtlety that it would be overlooked by modern readers, it'd be overlooked probably by men of the time, but the women of the time would see their fear manifested here, which is the loss of identity. That your identity is so wrapped up with a man that you probably will refer to as so and so's daughter, and then you're going to be referred to as so and so's wife, that you never quite have a name. You're not there, you're not making a stamp on the world most times. Now, the thing about modern readers is that they assume everyone during that time, or all women during that time, were so repressed and had no autonomy, no choices. But they had choices. It's just it was much more confined than it is today, and we don't have the extensive that we could have today either. But it's it's there, and we'll see it in this moment with the sentence of the mistress. But it's not to the extent, but also just like you're not making a stamp on the world with your name as much. It's very rare. It's very rare to have someone like Mary Shelley who made a stamp with her name, or Mary Wollstonecraft. You're not getting many women being standing out in history. It's men. You're just an extension. But it also, though, is fascinating that she's an extension of Hindley because I think that she's a manifestation of the Southern culture and Southern manners that is being brought to this small rural, like country, northern, home. They're bringing back this, metropolitan ideas and beliefs and culture, but it makes sense that it's being implemented by Hindley's wife, that she's a manifestation of it being implemented here. An outsider but being brought in by an insider who left and came back. And it's also showing me that she's very good at manipulating the sentence. And it doesn't make you would assume that with the description we have of her thus far, that she's very sickly and quiet and soft spoken and gentle, but you're seeing here that she has some skill, that she is manipulating Kathy, even if it's done with goodness of heart. It's still a manipulation because in a very short period of time, she recognizes the best way to get Kathy to convert into being society's ideal idea of a woman and how they should look and act and behave was through flattery, whereas like everything thus far has not worked that they've used to try to push Kathy to conforming. But Henley's wife knew that flattery and waving luxury goods and telling her that she's pretty and all these things, giving her a little bit of power. If you fit within the society, look, you can have some more power, is what she's kind of waving in front of her. It's the carrot, but it's also hiding the setback, which Kathy will learn when she marries Linton, the what you lose when you adhere to this. And I just like it's fascinating to think of Henley's wife as quiet, soft spoken, as someone that you so unassuming, but can implement a big change here. And it could have been for good, but it's going to be for bad, obviously, as we will see. But I think it's also kind of showing that, don't even the most unassuming could affect. It's kind of like bringing a different species into a new environment and then they come invasive. So it's kind of like that, I guess you could say. So then you have a conversation of, is it good to expand ideas and cultures, but what do you lose? Like, do you lose the original culture, those kind of things? Is it good? Is it bad? All those kind of conversations you can have. We then get a description of Kathy after returning from the Lintons and spending 5 weeks with them. She is described as, instead of a wild, hatless little savage jumping into the house and rushing to squeeze us all breathless, they are lighted from a handsome black pony, a very dignified person with brown ringlets falling from the cover of a feathered beaver, and a long cloth habit which she was obliged to hold up with both hands as she might sail in. And there's a couple things I want to dig in. First is my first impression of, for example, a wild, hatless savage jumping into the house and rushing to squeeze you. In my modern sensibilities, this image is heartwarming. Think at this moment in time, I am 95% sure she's 15. Imagine a 15-year-old that you know in your life rushing so excited to hug you. That's how much they miss you, how much joy that would bring you. And you want to see someone that age carefree and happy. And up to this point with Kathy too, we've seen that she lays everything out there. She doesn't hide or suppress any part of her. When she is happy, everyone knows she's happy and they're happy too. And when she's sad or mad, everyone knows and they equally suffer for it too. Which the goods and bads of that, there is no guessing with Kathy up to this point. She leaves everything out there. She shows her entire self. And then she starts to act reserved, starts keeping things away, starts constraining her emotions, as is expected of a young lady of this time. And even today, as a lady or a guy, we're expected to constrain our emotions. And moving on, though, I want to talk about the outfit because to me, fashion is extremely interesting, not only historical, but modern day. There's a lot of hidden meaning that you can mine from clothes, even if it's done subconsciously. You're putting a message out there every day. And so, first off, we hear about this hatless savage, and we have to remember up until very recently, I want to say like 50s, 60s, hats were pretty much a requirement. Like you were expected to wear hats. The later part, like 50s and 60s, is more when you would go out or be like do special events or go to church. But like before that, if you went out without a hat, people were going to look at you sideways and probably cross the street. Like it was deemed so wrong. And like the best way I can equate it is if like someone walks out in just their underwear, you're gonna cross the street and be like, what's wrong with you? You're missing something. Like hats were very vital, and I should probably do some research as to why they were vital. I just know that you were supposed to go outside with a hat, whether you were a lord or a lady or a poor farmer, you wore a hat. And so her running out without a hat shows this ungentility of her, but also freeness because there's no ribbons cinched to her chin. There's and like you can't run with a hat; it's gonna fall off. Even if you have a cinch, even if you have a hat pin digging into your head, you could run free without a hat. But with those, like it's constraining. There's pain sometimes, not always. It's not like tight lacing, but there's something there. It's the same as if you put a bobby pin in my hair right now. Like you would feel it and sense it. And to then go into someone that had a long cloth habit which she was obliged to hold up with both hands that she might sail in. You're seeing this constraint and this. I don't want to negatively look on this because there is some positives on why someone might be gravitating like Kathy towards such outfits. And it's because it gives you this luxury, which she yearns for, but also kind of a power. There's a power to someone that walks into the room with such luxury and like clothes like this, that if she walked around the neighborhood like that, the neighbors are going to look upon her with at least a semblance of respect and see her as a higher class. There's this, but at the same time, it is constraining because she has to use both hands just to hold the fabric up. She has no hands to do anything else but to hold this heavy cloth up to be able to walk. This is an outfit that is only meant to sit on a horse and look presentable. You don't gallop with it, you don't run, you can barely walk with it. It is heavy, but because it's heavy, it means there's money to it. And so there's a double-edged sword to some of these outfits. And same, for example, like the hat that she's wearing is a feathered beaver hat. That is a luxury good. It's not a straw bonnet. It's something that like the in the previous generation, so the Regency, I'm reading a lot of that right now. That would have been like foppish. Like the dandies of the time would be wearing that kind of hat. So it's very warm, also good for the area that they're living in, but like it's a hat. And I think like it's perched on you, like you're not doing much to like run because it's gonna fall off, like things like that. And then her brown ringlets, that meant that there was a curling iron involved, that she had to sit there patiently, and they're tight and they're, like the barrel, think those kind of curls, which means that they're kind of man-made curls, so not natural curls. And so then you can dig into the whole man-made element of her being that there's no realness anymore to her. As I had said previously, there's no authenticity. She is being man-made and manipulated to conform to societal standards. And once again, I don't want to make it negative because the thing with this story that I think Emily Bronte is trying to point out is that it's a lose-lose situation. That if you pursue Kathy's life as it had been thus far, you might be free, but you're also going to be, for the most part, alone and ostracized from society. But if you conform, what part of you are you killing off to conform? But at the same time, you have this luxury, you have society, you have comfort. So there's no good answer because with both choices, you're losing and hurting somewhere. So we finally learn the name of Hindley's wife. No longer is she just being called the mistress or Hindley's wife, as I've said already in this chapter, what that means, with how her identity is fixated on him, that she's an extension of him. But we learn her name is Frances, and that's fascinating to me because that is the masculine, it's the feminine version of a masculine name. It's an extension of a man still, which is very common of the times. You have a lot of Henriettas and Georgianas and things like that, which are the feminized version of Henry and George's. There are a lot of other examples similar to these, but like Francis is still a masculine name. And if, like, for example, if you go over to France, you're going to have like Prince Francis. Like you're gonna have Francis that's just the man name. And so compared to Isabella and Catherine, who their names are purely feminine. They're not the feminized version of a masculine name, to have Henley's wife's name be that says a whole lot more, that her identity, down to her name, has always been an extension of a man. She's always going to be an extension of a man. I might be, blue curtaining this a little bit too much, but it's, to me, fascinating. And I think Emily Bronte chose this name purposely based off the context of everything else we've learned thus far about Frances. I want to dig into what Isabella, Henley's wife, says. And I hate that I have to say Henley's wife, but if you were to say to me, oh, yeah, when Frances, I would not be able to tell you what character that is in Wuthering Heights, which also says a lot about this character, that she is forgettable unless you say it in context of her husband. Says a lot. But getting back to what she says, when her husband says, why, Kathy, you're quite a beauty. I should scarcely have known you. You look like a lady now. Isabella Linton is not to be compared with her, is she, Frances? And she responds with, Isabella has not her natural advantages, but she must mind and not grow wild again here. Ellen, help Miss Catherine off of her things. Stay, dear, you would disarrange your curls. Let me untie your hat. There's a couple things that I want to pick at with what Isabella says. Not Isabella, Frances says. First is, in regards to Isabella, is her comparing her Kathy's beauty with Isabella. And that should very subtly say a lot, and that is that the only currency, only worth that these two girls have is their beauty, because that's the only thing that they're going to have to offer, because they are, for the most part, equals in society, while one is a little bit more genteel than the other and abides by society. For the most part, like, to Frances' mind, they're equals, and then what's the thing to offer their beauty, or Kathy's beauty could outweigh Isabella's wealth, per se, on the marriage market, because that is their only goal in life, is to get married at this point in time for a young lady in this position in society, which is sad. And I think Emily Bronte is pointing that out, that their entire identity is wrapped around that. And which it shouldn't be, as we see, like, women of this time, you have mathematicians and writers and so many brilliant women and things like that, but the propaganda and what society is pushing for is more subservient young ladies with only the idea of getting married. And they also hate romantics. They despised that at that time because they thought it ruined marriages and had too hopeful and made ill marriages. I can get into that, but let's move on. She also says Ellen instead of Nellie, which to me that stands out, because giving the formal kind of Christian name and not a nickname, I think that's fascinating, because I think, like, it's showing kind of a distance, like a familiarity if you give a nickname. There's a distance, like she's distancing herself from the servant. But I also, like, as I don't know, I think it's equally interesting that she isn't calling her Nellie, but calling her Ellen. It's kind of giving her more airs, or elevating her slightly, and like what you would call a young lady. Like, there's a doubleness to this. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something there, and I'd love to know what you think. But like, that stood out to me. The last thing is her saying Miss Catherine, calling her that, which is what she would be called in society, Miss Catherine or Miss Earnshaw. But instead of Kathy, again, no nicknames. But she says she must mind not grow wild again here, talking about her in front of her, but not to her, to not grow wild, as though Hindley has power over her, or Hindley's eye on her will prevent her. But also, the other thing that caught my attention is that they're not far from the Lintons. It's not like, Hindley, who went to the South to go to school and like changed and learned of a different society and culture and mannerisms and coming back. Like, they're just down the street, but yet you see a very different kind of culture. And also, Frances's fear that is Kathy being back home will revert to her wild ways. So what is that? I think, like, it kind of shows Frances's perception of this home, of this community, of this town, like, kind of like assuming how easily one could fall back into savagery here unless you're constantly around polite society. There's something there again. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it caught my attention. And the last thing is, she says, help Miss Catherine off of her things. Stay dear. You're disarrange your curls. Let me tie your hat. Once again, as I previously mentioned with her clothes, a constraining. She cannot move. She's not allowed to, you know, take off her own hat, that someone else must do it, that she cannot disarrange her curls, and how easily they can be disarranged. So, like, to keep everything perfect, you must stay still. Confining Kathy, who had once won free through the moors with no shoes. And these, like, this is just one paragraph, the first paragraph in chapter 7, and there's so much that has already changed and dug into, and it's very subtle, which is what I love about Emily Bronte. And I will continue to say this because we have lost the art of subtlety in books, I feel like, recently. But I love that you can read this and read it as is, but then people of that time, or even if you know a little bit more, or if you're actually digging into it like I am, you're going to notice this conversation Emily Bronte is having behind it about societal expectations, about gender, about, you know, cultures. All these things are being quietly said behind the words, if that makes sense. And this is why I'm having so much fun doing this. We then have Kathy and Heathcliff meeting for the first time since she has been away with the Lintons for 5 weeks, recovering from her sprained ankle. First off, it's only been 5 weeks. 5 weeks, a little over a month. And she has changed this drastically, at least outwardly. It's very surface level, as we will come to see. But like, it's just funny to me because like the best way to equate it is that friend that studies abroad, and it's for a very short period of time, and then they come back thinking that they're so much more sophisticated and worldly and like correct you on the pronunciation, and they throw in random like words from the language, but really they don't know the language and all these kind of things. Like, that's what it feels like to me. But this is the first time that who Kathy is and who Heathcliff is in the eyes of this world, this society, their status in it is now outwardly apparent with how clean and how richly dressed Kathy is, in opposition to Heathcliff, who had been ignored previously, but even more so during that time that Kathy was gone, that the only one that thought and remembered him was Nellie, and she was the only one that would bid him wash himself once a week. And children of his age seldom have a natural pleasure in soap and water. Therefore, not to mention his clothes, which had seen 3 months' service in mire and dust, and his thick, uncombed hair, the surface of his face and hands were dismally beclouded. In my head, I picture him looking like Pigpen from Peanuts. That is completely different. Like, picture Pigpen and then picture like an angel. Like, you could not look more different in this moment. And that's why Nellie says he might well skulk behind the settle on beholding such a bright, graceful damsel enter the house instead of a rough-headed counterpart of himself. So he's seen, like, all of a sudden, like, there's a difference between the two of us, and things are about to change, because I want to go a little bit blue curtains on this, because if you look at them as one being, they're on the cusp of adulthood, and Heathcliff's kind of representing the childhood, and Kathy is representing adulthood, what it would look like. And what it would look like is adhering to society, cleaning up, acting more reserved, acting by the rules of society, whereas Heathcliff is dirty and just free and does what he wants and ignored, but has his counterpart. Like, they have each other. And the two of them are now straddling this period of time. They're now straddling this division where all of a sudden you have to change if you want to be a part of this society. Like, they don't have to, as I've mentioned previously, but they don't realize just yet what a future could look like continuing as their childhood self, because they don't have an example of that to look at being like, oh, that could be us. The only examples that they have is all these other adults abiding by what society expects of adults and your status and things like that. And to abide by it, they then would lose one another. It's like losing your childhood friend after a handful of years because you grew apart. You now have different likes, different friends, different, you know, beliefs and things like that. That's what they're straddling right now. So they're in this moment while they're kind of standing on opposite ends of the spectrum and of the room and of each other and feel this divide, they simultaneously are the same person straddling this transition period. So yeah, I think like that's something I want to like dig into like in an essay that I'm working on is like less the romantic part of like that being like, Kathy is the counterpart of himself, and whatever his soul and mind are made of are the same, like less romantic but more as like they're the same person and they're just a representation of if they made different choices and what they're doing. But we're also going to see that this is a moment that you can kind of put a pin in as like a turning point that is going to change Heathcliff at least, but also Kathy. As I previously mentioned, this new version of Kathy is very exterior, is very surface level. It's a mask, it's a character that she's playing, coming in gracefully, kissing Nellie on the cheek, not hugging her as she normally would, not petting the dog. She's playing a role that immediately falls away the minute she sees Heathcliff. She rushes to him and embraces him. She bestowed 7 or 8 kisses on his cheek within the second and then stopped and drawing back burst into laughter. And that's the old Kathy. And it's showing that, like, despite you cleaning her up and having her perform, the old Kathy's still there. It's just, we're going to see it slowly die, as you could say, as she steps farther and farther into adulthood and society. But, like, Heathcliff is that, like, thing that helps her keep her childhood self alive, whether it's good or bad, because you could, see in a good light of like it's a good thing, like her freedom and just pure self, but also bad because they also bring out the worst in each other. And that's why like this story is not black and white pretty much. But the other thing I want to touch on is what she exclaims when she laughs. She goes, "Why, how very black and cross you look, and how funny and grim! But that's because I'm used to Edgar and Isabella Linton. Well, Heathcliff, have you forgotten me?" And first off, like, while Heathcliff, have you forgotten me? It's this assumption that you go into adulthood and you leave behind your childhood and you assume others forgot you. Like, you have that you can touch on. But the thing that really caught my attention was, "Why, how very black and cross you look." And on one level, black and cross is just another way of describing like you look angry, you look sullen, like it's one way, like a black feature, like it's that's not the right term, but there's a term like similar to that where it's just describing like being sullen. And on the other hand, when having then, but that's because I'm used to Edgar and Isabel Linton, having them then being compared to Heathcliff, that line, how very black, has another meaning. You can then impose that she's talking about his skin color, how being around Isabella and Edgar Linton are very white, you can assume, especially like, even Nellie notes that when Kathy removes her gloves, a purely white hand emerges from having done nothing and seen no sun for the last handful of weeks. That is the people that she's been around, purely white. And Heathcliff looks, not only his skin naturally dark, but probably even darker being so dirty, is, again, outwardly separating them. And I think it's Kathy realizing now in this moment too, like how very different he is from others, from society, and then now entering a grander society, at least other society, noticing how much Heathcliff is not a part of it, how much of an interloper he is with this community, and her having to decide kind of in this, like she's almost like, oh, just noticing it now, never having noticed it before, but hasn't quite processed yet how she's going to react to it and like what this is going to mean. But I think that this moment is going to play a role later when Edgar does propose to her and you have this conversation of her and Nellie, of her debating. And I think this might play a role later in that. And so, like, yeah, there's just that stood out to me. And I think that there's a double meaning in that. Quickly, before I get back into this chapter, I forgot how old Kathy was, and I also fell victim of wanting to age her up because of her being pushed towards adulthood, because of her knowing that she's going to get married rather soon and courted and stuff. I, in my head, was imagining her to be about 15, but I remember not that long ago I had learned canonically her age, and that was chapter 6, like the previous chapter. And on page 56 of my copy, we have Heathcliff saying that Isabella, I believe she is 11, a year younger than Kathy. This is the night that Kathy gets injured and then is forced to kind of stay with the Lintons for 5 weeks. It's only been 5 weeks. So she would still be roughly about 12, at most 13, but most likely still 12 during these events, which kind of makes sense because that is the average age of puberty. But I don't want you to believe that it would have been normal for her to restart being pushed towards marriage, because that was not at all the average marriage age for females. Like, historically, it was much older than we have been led to believe. It is the same as like tight lacing of corsets. It is another false narrative that for some reason we're pushed to believe. I can only think of one case off the top of my head, which is Margaret Beaufort, which is King Henry VII's mother, did get married at 12 and pregnant shortly after, but she is an extremely rare occurrence. And if you look at the other women of her time, they got married much later. The average is about 18 often. And I think at this time it would still have been roughly that, like 16 to 18 would have been on the younger side. Like 16 still would have been on the younger side. 12 would have been an anomaly. So, but it wouldn't be like, I don't know. It's hard because I'm like trying to picture like how old Marianne and Eleanor's youngest sister was, because in my head I imagine her being 10 or 12 based on how she's dressed and how she acts. But we also have to think of the environment that Kathy is existing in this moment in time, and maybe even the fact that Hindley himself is already married, his wife is already married, and they're probably rather young themselves, thinking that they're older than they are. They probably think that pushing Kathy towards adult pursuits of acting like an adult, dressing like an adult, thinking about marriage might mature her personality more, that she's just, is so wild. So that might play a role in why she's being pushed towards this a little bit more than she should be. But like, even the way that she's acting and stuff is different than like Isabella. Like the description we got from Heathcliff in the previous chapter, Heathcliff's description, Isabella and Edgar are very childlike. And yet now we're getting an image of Kathy being presented like a little adult. So now I'm questioning the validity of this. How truthful is Nellie? Is she fudging the ages and the years and things like that? Like, it's hard to tell, and I'm not gonna make a definitive answer, but it's just something I want us to think about. But also remember, she's only 12, at least in this version of the tale. Remember her age, and that's also going to explain things going forward in this chapter. So as I just said, remember their age. Kathy and Heathcliff. Kathy's definitively, like canonically, as we learned in the previous chapter, about 12. Heathcliff could be the same age or roughly a year or two older than her. Still, though, not a fully developed frontal cortex. So when, Kathy asks if he has forgotten her, and Nellie says she had some reason to put the question, for shame and pride threw double gloom over his countenance and kept him immovable. And very rarely are we getting direct emotions like told to us. Shame and pride. And these are very distinct emotions that we are going to see play a huge role going forward. We should put a pin in it because we're going to see that those two emotions are going to influence many of these characters, but especially Heathcliff's choices. Because once again, he is roughly 12 to 14 here. Shame and pride is going to play a big role in how he reacts to a lot of things going forward, but we should also not critique him too harshly for it, because think back to when you were that age and how quickly you would react to your own pride and shame in moments. Like, this is not uncommon. It's just unfortunate that it was not curbed, that it just kept getting worse and worse. It became an avalanche instead of a small snowball kind of thing. As I previously said, this moment right here will change the trajectory of their lives. It is such a pivotal moment, and it's not only that, you see it also how it quickly changes Kathy and Heathcliff's relationship. You see how one is starting to court with adulthood while the other is clinging to childhood, and the awkwardness of this, which is so relatable not only today but obviously historically. And for me, my mind immediately went to what started as like a stand-up comedy thing that became a documentary, that became a podcast. I saw it's a documentary, which is people coming up on stage to read excerpts of their childhood diary, and then I listened to the podcast. It's hilarious. I cannot remember the title of it off the top of my head, but there's one particular episode of the podcast I'm thinking of right now where the girl who had written in her childhood diary about how she's about to start high school and all her friends are acting in very adult-like ways. They want to pursue such manners, whereas she just wants to stay home and play for Barbie still, and the awkwardness of that. And that's what I'm feeling here in this moment with, like, Mr. Earnshaw, who's Henley, which is crazy to me because he's still rather young, but he is the master of the house. It's just crazy because I'm still thinking of his father, as you will see in a moment. But he says, "Shake hands, Heathcliff," condescendingly, "once in a way that is permitted." "I shall not," replied the boy, finding his tongue at last. "I shall not stand to be laughed at. I shall not bear it." And he would have broken from the circle, but Miss Cathy seized him again. "I did not mean to laugh at you," she said. "I could not hinder myself, Heathcliff. Shake hands at least." And it stands out to me because it feels very mirroring to, like, when they first met, when they were kids, when Heathcliff was first presented and Hindley and Kathy just kind of stood staring as their parents kind of bickered over what was happening. But the moment that, like, Kathy realized that her whip had been lost while attending to the stranger, she showed her humor by grinning and spitting at the stupid little thing, earning for her pains a sound blow from her father to teach her cleaner manners. And that is, like, almost is literally mirroring, because it's the same kind of thing going on, a first kind of meeting-esque interaction, but it goes very differently. Whereas Kathy is the one that physically harms Heathcliff by spitting at him, which goes into Heathcliff. Everything with him is a physical harm, him being flogged and things like that. Whereas Kathy is harmed more emotionally or internally, with her being starved, as we've seen in the previous chapter. And we see it in this second kind of, introduction, where Heathcliff kind of critiquing Kathy and then wanting to run away, which hurts her more emotionally, as we see. But the other thing is that it hurts because it's for the first time him almost like he doesn't truly see Kathy anymore, who she really is, that this is the new person. This is kind of a changeling, that she's not only outwardly changed, she is inwardly changed, as he is trying to say, because Heathcliff, who knows Kathy, supposedly their soul are the same, would know that that is her normal humor, that she normally laughs at people, that she normally is humorous unless she is really annoyed. But Nellie talks about it often, how often she laughs at other people. And it's not always done maliciously. But in this moment, Heathcliff is calling her out and saying that he's taking it maliciously. And he should know her. He should know that she doesn't mean it cruelly. She's just possibly uncomfortable and trying to play this character. And it's just manifesting in this way. And then him calling her out like that hurts her. But it's also showing to us as the readers, on at least this close read, the divide that's starting, the wall that's starting to be built between the two of them, that Even though Kathy and Heathcliff might claim that they have the same soul, obviously not anymore, because obviously they do not see their true, genuine selves anymore. And as I said, Kathy is putting on a mask of adulthood, that she is losing her genuine self, that lively, free child that she once was. So, in this brief moment, there's a lot of nuance going on. There's a lot of layers going on. And this is once again why I love doing this. So after spending 5 weeks with the Lintons, Kathy and Heathcliff meet for the first time. And as I just had previously said, it is mirroring their actual first time meeting each other back in an earlier chapter. And by mirroring, I mean it's the same but opposite, that instead of Kathy harming Heathcliff, it's Heathcliff harming Kathy. But I want to continue with what Kathy says to him. She says, I did not mean to laugh at you. I could not hinder myself, Heathcliff. Shake hands at least. What are you sulking for? It was only that you looked odd. If you wash your face and brush your hair, it will be all right, but you are so dirty. And it seems benign because it is benign, but it's not. There's a depth to it, especially when you're a child. Those benign things become massive in our heads. And I believe Emily Bronte is talking about, like, if you just clean your face and brush your hair, if you convert, there's like layers in that, like not only converting to Christianity, because that obviously is playing a role of religion, we see it time and time again, but also into adulthood. And I think that is what Emily Bronte is like very slyly maybe talking about, maybe subconsciously, is this converting from childhood to adulthood. And it might be as benign as brushing your hair and not being so dirty, as we saw that Kathy previously would not brush her hair. She looked wild. But then you have this like illusion of what you gain as an adult, these freedoms, but as we know as adults, it was an illusion. Like, we don't really gain as much freedoms as we thought, like a little bit more than as a child, but maybe like in the case of Kathy and Heathcliff, they seem a lot more free, but have a lot less like supervision and love. So like it's a give and take. It's always a double-edged sword. But for Emily Bronte, who, if you look up even the most simple of her history with her sisters, they grew up in a household where they were allowed to indulge in whimsy and imaginations and making up stories and reading and all these things, to then have to go into adulthood and be kind of told to put those aside. This is part of the reason why the three of them wrote under a masculine pen name, not only to be taken credibly, but to be allowed to do it. Why so many people, not people, so many women who were writers, it's rare to find a married one. It's not uncommon. They do exist, especially during this time. I can name probably a few, but there are others who put their pen down willingly, like the author of The Mysteries of Udolpho. And many people thought she was dead because she disappeared, but it's just she got married and moved on and she felt like she was done writing. But you have ones like Jane Austen, who was afraid of getting married and being forced to put down her pen. And so, Emily Bronte is back in her childhood home reading this after being out in the world and straddling adulthood and childhood. You're in your childhood home, but you are an adult and you're expected to do adult things, but you want to indulge in your childhood hobbies. And you feel the pressures and the constraints of adulthood, the expectations of those other adults around you to behave in a certain way, to do certain things, to conform. And what does that do to you and your individuality and your soul? And I think that is the theme of the story, besides revenge. Like, that is one of the themes, is the awkwardness of transition to childhood and adulthood, and the like society's expectations harming us, I guess you could argue. There's so many you could argue with this, but like with this mention, is so much going on here, because it might seem benign to anyone listening to Kathy's words, but to Heathcliff, it might have so much more meaning. It's to him showing that this isn't his Kathy anymore. She's been converted. She's been brainwashed into becoming an adult. She's 12, as a reminder, and expects him to do so. And this probably is one of the building blocks of reasons why he goes off and tries to conform, to at least put on this illusion of being like a white gentleman, of owning land, of getting money, and of doing these things. Like, you see this going forward, and this is probably one of the early shoves. It's from Gaffey saying something as simple as this. There's more I could say about just this line and the depths to it. And I would love to know what you think, Kathy and Heathcliff's relationship, what's going on here, this transition, and they may not even be aware of it in the moment themselves. To continue on this conversation about childhood and kind of forcing into adulthood and expectations, this awkward period of time in everyone's lives, whether it's modern or historical, you're going to see this happening. And you see it here with Heathcliff responding, "You needn't have touched me. I shall be as dirty as I please, and I like to be dirty, and I will be dirty." It seems petulant. It seems childish of a response. It seems silly. And he's anywhere from 12 to, 14, 15 in my head. He's close to Kathy's age. We know canonically Kathy is 12. And at the same time, like, it seems right. Like, if you stop to think, like, I remember being 12 to 14, but not only that, like, I would coach kids those ages, and like these would be the responses that they would give in a very emotional moment in time. And it's silly, and you kind of revert because you haven't figured out how to kind of contextualize what you're feeling and thinking, and so you just react. At the same time, at least he's not smothering how he feels, but at the same time, like, it's understandable, that's a natural reaction. We inherently also cringe. We want him to act more adult like, don't say that, don't act like that, like, come on, like, be an adult in this situation, but he's technically a child. So like, it's such a weird period of time, and it's got to be so confusing. And like, I remember it being kind of confusing, where you're like straddling, where you're like expected to act like an adult, but then not treated like an adult and not allowed to do things. But then you thought you could do things because you thought you were an adult, but really, if you look back, you're like, God, I was way too young for that, or to think I could do that. Like, that's such a strange thing that, like, I actually now have written down that I want to work on a whole essay on this. And if you like, I want to compare it with Romeo and Juliet, the like adultification kind of childhood and the tragedy it can ensue in those kind of things. So like, look forward to hopefully that once I find time. I'm working on a few other things right now. I'm so behind. I have so many things I'm working on. It's my ADHD really kicking in. But I just want to point out his reaction, and it's a reminder, like, of his age, that like this line in itself should remind you of his age. Once again, like, thanks to the movies, we imagine these characters older than they actually are. And because we want to romanticize things, which like we shouldn't in this moment, but like, it's a reminder, like, they are just kids being forced to act like adults. As I mentioned previously, Emily Bronte was a poet. She wrote a lot of poetry prior to writing this book. Because of that, she is very conscious of her wording and her word choices and the economy and things like that. And that's why there's a lot of layers behind her choices. And so, for example, Nellie then says, after playing lady's maid to the newcomer and putting my cakes in the oven and making the house and kitchen cheerful with great fires befitting Christmas Eve, I want to focus on after playing lady's maid to the newcomer. There's two things I want to focus on there. Playing lady's maid. Playing. As I mentioned previously, I think that Kathy is playing an adult. She's acting. It's a mask. And you see it slip a little bit as she goes to Heathcliff and things like that, as I previously mentioned. It's a performance. It's deep down in her soul. She does not believe it. She does not feel it. It feels constraining. That's not her true self. She's just play acting in this moment, thinking it's a game. And even Nellie is playing along, playing the lady's maid. It doesn't seem like she's played that for Hindley's wife. She has a lot of other jobs. It doesn't seem like they have a whole lot of other servants. Like, she's almost like an all around, maid. And then to the newcomer, calling Kathy a newcomer. as though this is a completely different person, a changeling almost, which would make sense with a fairy folklore, which is very prevalent in the Moors and things like that. You see it referenced already. This is a brand new person. This is not our previous Kathy. This is a new Kathy. And it's interesting that Nellie is calling her that. Not saying like, a return or calling her anything else, but a newcomer, as if it's a stranger in this household. So what do you think about that? As Nellie mentioned, she's preparing for Christmas Eve, and there's a lot I want to unpack here. So, Christmas Eve takes place during the winter, as we all know, and as we probably remember from, middle school, high school English classes. There's symbolism there. Think of Robert Frost. So, winter is the end of a life cycle, a death, the coming, like again, the ending of something. And we see this here, as I've mentioned time and time again during this chapter already. In my head, this is a linchpin. This is a turning point for a lot of the characters, but especially Kathy and Heathcliff. This is the point where we see the strain in their relationship, and I don't mean romantic, but just in general. And also them straddling between childhood and adulthood. But we also see a change for Nellie, that this is a coming to an end for her too, because Christmas is a time to come together, to be with family and loved ones. And while Christmas during this time looks not nothing, but not as similar to what it is today or even the Victorians, because the Victorians is where we inherited a lot of our traditions that we have today. But it still was a time to come together and be with your loved ones. And yet, Nellie is saying here that I prefer to sit down and amuse myself by singing carols all alone, regardless of Joseph's affirmation that he considered the merry tunes I chose next door to songs. And then later, under these circumstances, I remained solitary. Like, she didn't have to write all alone. That was a comma, all alone. And I remained solitary. She chose to say that. And it's her noticing and pointing out that all of a sudden she's been ostracized. Prior to Hindley coming back and bringing back Southern traditions and customs and the way they behave in society, she had once been a part of this family. She had once been in the main room by the fire with all of them, sitting near old Mr. Earnshaw and the children. But now she is ostracized to the kitchen. She is all alone, trying to amuse herself in an almost childlike way of singing songs to herself. You see that commonly with kids who are trying to comfort themselves or amuse themselves. And Nellie is not that much older than the rest of them. While Kathy is 12, Nellie, we know, is roughly about the same age, if not maybe a year older than Hindley. And Hindley, we do know concretely when, at least page 45 of my copy, when he first met Heathcliff, we have this line that Hindley, where is this? I had it. He was 14, like he was behaving in a way that was not behoovent of oh, there we go. He had promised them the former was a boy of 14, but when he drew out what had been his fiddle, crushed some morsels in a greatcoat, he blubbered aloud. And we also know that he had spent 3 years away. We just don't know if he went shortly within the same year or if it was a year or two after. So he could be anywhere from 17 to, I want to say, 20 at most. So let's say he's 19. He's 19, he's married, and he's the master of this house and in charge of all these people. He's 19. You're probably a freshman in college. Nellie is probably 20, 21, 22 at most. Still very childish herself. Also, roughly about the average age of getting married about this time, but still young, on the cusp of adulthood, cusp of being in charge of things. But while she has been adultified herself to be a parent for all these others like Hindley, Kathy, and Heathcliff, she's still inherently a child. Her brain is still, frontal cortex is not fully developed. She still would feel, especially in a moment like this, the people that she had once been so close to, a sister to, feeling physically and emotionally separated from. So we're going to see now a change, and maybe I want to keep my eye out for this in this read through of how that's going to affect her telling going forward too. We are also informed that the Lintons are going to be spending Christmas Eve with the Earnshaws that they're going to come and visit with the preface that Heathcliff, aka the naughty swearing boy, would be kept away from her sweet darlings, as though he would corrupt them. And there's something I want to pick at here because it's again the assumption that that is his normal, which kind of is. She's not entirely wrong, but you're not assuming that he would be pushed to that extreme in that extreme moment. He was afraid. He was afraid for his friend. He was trying to be brave and scary to defend his friend. It was a scary moment. And instead of assuming that was in the moment kind of reaction, they assume this is every day. And yes and no, but it then kind of manifests into a self-fulfilling prophecy where him being seen as that, he becomes kind of that while simultaneously putting on the mask of what they are, this gentility. So it's like you get this like nuance of Heathcliff going forward, but also self-fulfilling prophecy going on there. But I also want to pick on how this is showing kind of once again how society views Kathy, Heathcliff, and Oldham, how they are being treated once again, just as Kathy was treated with much more kindness and sympathy, whereas he was shoved out the door in the last chapter. This is another moment for Heathcliff, another, brick to add to show like we're in different worlds because that's what society has decided. And the older Lintons, Mr. and Mrs. Linton, the parents, I think, are supposed to represent that. They're supposed to represent gentility, the genteel society, beliefs, ideas, etiquette, those kind of things that are pressuring others, that are telling others, this is how we act, this is what we do, conform, colonialize kind of stuff. Like you could dig into all those kind of stuff, not only on the personal, but on a global scale, the colonialism of converting other, countries to be like the British. Like you could dig into that if you really want to. And I think like I said, the parents are representing that. They're coming into the house now. So not only do you have Hindley coming back with some of his Southern culture, but like his wife representing it, but now you have the Lintons representing this. And it's changing the culture of this environment. And you could argue that it's kind of representing a little bit of what Scottish and Irish felt like, with the English coming in and wanting to ban their culture and convert them to the British back then. I'm talking out of my ass because I don't know this too well. I know very surface level, so I don't want to offend anyone, but like that exists. And there's so much here that you can just unpack. I just had a realization about Nellie's character, and this is one of the reasons why I have been doing close reads and enjoying it so much, is that like I've read Wuthering Heights so many times over the years, like ever since I first read it in 5th grade, and I'm 33 now. But it's not like this, like same with the Hunger Games. Like when I did a close read of that, I realized and saw things from a different perspective and a different lens, and it made it a richer story. And in this moment, I'm realizing about Nellie because I've always saw her as background, as almost a godlike narrator, like she's telling me things but not really there. And in this, I'm realizing more that we're getting more of her perspective, more of her opinions and thoughts and feelings than I remembered. And I think part of it is that like my first introduction to Wuthering Heights was the 1992 movie. And she's there but not quite there, so like she feels so secondary. And even though like the story isn't about her, I didn't realize how much she's a part of this. And in this moment, for example, my realization is that Nellie is equally important because she is a character that you can compare and contrast with Kathy. That she, I guess you could say, is a foil. I want to double check my definition of foil because I feel like I'm using it wrong. But you compare and contrast her because these are two young girls growing up in the same household. Nellie's, I would say, about maybe 8 years older than her. She's the same age as Hindley, and always kind of the way that she talks, sees herself as like a big sister to the others, like Hindley and Heathcliff and Kathy, but recognizes at the same time her place in the family. and she has a place in this family prior to old Earnshaw dying. And you see that the deviations, though, at the same time, you see the contrasting. She's a servant, Kathy's a young lady. You see then, like, they're growing apart as they get older. Like, their place in society and what society dictates means that they need to be separated now. That Nellie now belongs in the kitchen alone, as she describes in this chapter, whereas, Kathy needs to be in the center of society, but she needs to act differently. She needs to curb her liveliness. She needs to dress more appropriately. And it's fascinating too because you're seeing, like, according to Nellie at least, she's doing everything right. Like, she is quiet, she is kind, she is gentle, she is, does what everyone wants her to do, breaks a little bit, like, she sings songs that Joseph is against, but Joseph is overly religious. She's a good person. She's in the kitchen where she belongs as a woman of this time and, like, alone, separated from others. And in this moment, like, she's describing all the things that she had done. She had decorated, she had cleaned, everything's polished, everything's good, but there's no one to, compliment her anymore because old Earnshaw's not there anymore. She's not part of the family anymore. Whereas, like, Kathy bucked against the system, bucked and was wild and crazy and petulant. And yet it seems like she's getting more rewards. She's being pulled into society. She is being, like, others want to be within her society. I'm rambling because, like, this is just slowly unfurling in my head at, at the same time. But this is something I'm definitely going to be looking at going forward. But, like, I think the fascinating thing is that we know that Nellie and Kathy grew up together almost as sisters, but because of their place in society, they have to grow apart and they get treated differently. And while one does everything right, is alone and, you know, kind of treated poorly, whereas the other who bucks against what they want gets more for at least physical stuff. Like, she gets to be a lady, she gets to have rich clothes and gets people want her, people want to marry her, things like that. And I think, like, it's not only a tale of pride and childhood adultification and things and, like, revenge and things like that, but I think it's also a tale of, like, treating others well and a tale of the injustices that you can do everything right, but because of where you were born, it doesn't matter. Like, there's so much you can just unpack in this moment. And, like, now I want to put down on my list of essays I want to write and focus on comparing and contrasting of Nellie and Kathy because their characters are fascinating and I never really lumped them together before. So I would love to know what you think about them. As Nellie is telling us that she had, like, cleaned and decorated and everything, she's so proud of her work, but she's sitting there alone, solitary, and she gets sad because she thinks of how when old Mr. Earnshaw was once alive, he would come down and compliment her and give her a shilling in a Christmas box. And she then thought about his fondness for Heathcliff. And again, we have to think of how old Earnshaw is what the Bible preached, like a kindness to others, but yet you have people like Joseph who, is uber religious to an extreme, but yet he is cruel and mean and ostracizing. So I like the commentary that she's having about religion, which we see still prevalent to today. But going back, she's thinking about old Earnshaw and his kindness actually created that family around him. He created this welcoming environment, and now with that person gone, it's cold and they're all separated and separated into different rooms, as I talked about now, as everyone's in separate rooms with these things. And she thinks of Heathcliff. And it's in this moment, I think that she's so alone that she and is not quite allowed to go interact with Hindley and Kathy anymore, that she's like, well, I don't want to be alone, and the only other person that's alone with me is Heathcliff, so I guess we can be alone together, kind of thing. And wants to mother him and, like, help him a little bit and try. It's such a dual thing going on. Like, she wants to do good, like, she wants to embody old Earnshaw's ways of being kind to others and helpful, and she wants to help Heathcliff and guide him and prevent him from falling down farther. But simultaneously, like, I think she is a little bitter about how life is pushing all of them right now. I think she is a little bitter about being so removed and solitary, but yet having such a place in their lives still, but like not loved and welcome and thanked as she once had been. And it simultaneously wants, I think, has like maybe a subconscious desire to be with them still. Like, and now it's even greater when you have this separation that is like, I, of course, I want to be amongst the rich family, not with this ostracized boy, because what does that say about me? But like, that's all I have. That's the only person left to pick, kind of thing. So you can see Nellie's decision in this moment as both good, but also very biased. She is tainted by the society that is especially rampant right now. There is no one like old Earnshaw, bringing goodness in. And I think like Heathcliff is definitely going to make it hard for her, and it's gonna sway some things going forward. But like in this moment, she decides instead of crying, she's actually gonna do something about it, which I really like that about Nellie. That like she's like, all right, let's actually do something. Let's actually help him. Let's do something to change maybe things are. And maybe she's seeing that Heathcliff could be that person that changes, like welcomes her back into Hindley and Kathy's lives, because he at least is a step closer thanks to Kathy, I guess you could say. I don't know. I'm rambling, but there's something there, and I think the most important thing and the person that we forget about in the story a lot is old Earnshaw, and I what he represented, which is the epitome of a good Christian, of kindness, and how quickly that fell apart in this house. As I mentioned in my Christmas Wuthering Heights video, going into this chapter mostly, but focusing on the Christmas aspect, I talked about how this chapter wonderfully illustrates the awkwardness between childhood and adulthood. You're no matter what time in history, there's always going to be a period in time in everyone's lives where we're awkwardly straddling the two ends and we're treated weirdly. And you see it here with, Nellie telling Heathcliff, make haste, Heathcliff. The kitchen is so comfortable and Joseph is upstairs. Make haste and then let me dress you smart before Miss Cappy comes out. And then you can sit together with the whole hearth to yourself and have a long chatter to bedtime, which feels like something you would say to a teenager. Be like, I'm going to leave some food out. You guys can have the living rooms to yourself. And as an adult or an older sibling or a parent, you're like, look, they're gonna play like they're adults, but the way that you're presenting it, you're treating them like a kid. Like, isn't it cute that they want to be like adults? Like almost like a little girl playing tea time. And it continues then with like Nellie saying to Heathcliff, come, are you coming? There's a little cake for each of you, nearly enough, and you'll need a half hour's dawning. So one, she wants to wash him up, which feels like something you would do to a child, but two, the promise of a cake, which you would offer a child. And so they're in this strange period where like they're still being treated like children by say Nellie, and we're going to see it again with Earnshaw, but also being like, isn't it cute that they want to be like adults? Let them act like adults, but still treating them like kids. But then we have Heathcliff who responds in an adult way. It's not a good response, but it's a response that you would see probably more commonly in adults than like a kid, which is avoiding and pretending to work till 9 to avoid the situation. And then we have Kathy coming down. She had stayed up late, having a world of things to order for the reception of her new friends. She's playing the mistress. She's taking on this adult role of hosting her friends and ordering the servants around, which again, it's very play acting too, because she's in that straddling period. And so this is just wonderfully showing that awkwardness of kind of wanting to be adults, but kind of wanting to be kids, and kind of like older figures in their lives thinking it's cute that they want to act like adults. So you kind of make it seem more childish. And it's such a strange period of time. And it's the same as like also being like, you should act like an adult, but then when you're trying to reminded you're just a kid, and we're going to see that more in this chapter too. But The other thing like I wanted to point out was that God, there's I had it in the back of my head. This is the problem. Like, you're like, hold on, I gotta hold on to this detail. I'm gonna talk about this. Oh, it's that this change came on almost, it feels like suddenly to us as the readers, and it happened after the whole incident at the Linton household, of them being caught, Kathy being snared by a dog, and them being separated, and then Kathy being forced into being adulthood. That was the catalyst of this change, and it's interesting because not often can you see like a hard line between the two, moments in life, but we're seeing it with this experience with the Lintons. That is the moment where like I said in that chapter, it's almost like Haffy, the dog, is like society latching its jaws on Haffy and forcing the two of them then to have to grow up, to stop acting wild and childish, which is also very interesting when you see, Nellie talking about fairies. She's saying that a little bit later that, Heathcliff didn't come. His cake and cheese remained on the table all night for the fairies. And there's more I could dig into about the fairies. There's not a lot here specifically, but it's interesting that it keeps coming up. And I think with Nellie saying that, referencing that, feels very of the culture of their neighborhood where they live. They would loosely believe in the fairies, they would leave food out and talk about it. So again, we're seeing the traditionalism versus new stuff. So traditionalism can be embodied by like the culture and it being usurped or colonialized by Southern culture and lost and treated differently, but simultaneously there is an aspect of Heathcliff and Kathy that feels very like, and there's a whole argument you can get into there. The other thing I mentioned in my Christmas video was how this chapter makes it very apparent the shift that happens in this household. It was starting to come previously ever since Earnshaw had returned. Nellie notes like all of a sudden they have been removed. They're separated. They're not in the family room like they once were. And we see like even her kind of quietly by herself arranging and getting ready for Christmas, that she isn't eating dinner as a family, nor do we know that they ate dinner before, but it seems out of place as she talks about eating with just Joseph. But also her saying that Kathy stayed up late, having a world of things to order for the reception of her new friends. She came into the kitchen once to speak to her old one. And it's almost as though Nellie is blind. And Nellie plays such a fascinating character in this moment because Nellie wants Kathy to lean into the role that she's supposed to be, like a nice fine lady, grow up nicely, and do well. She wants her to marry Linton later because it would do well in her life based off what society is dictating. That is what Kathy is expected to do. But simultaneously not realizing the repercussions and is almost blind to the repercussions to their relationship. By Kathy leaning into this role and the ideas of society, and especially new traditions coming from the South and new cultures and stuff like that, that would dictate that they wouldn't have a relationship anymore. They would be separated. That, for instance, the Linton household, the servants are almost non-existent and they're very background, very like they're there and they have respect, but they're not part of the family like they were with the Earnshaws, as we saw in early chapters. And Nellie grew up with the other kids. She grew up almost like a big sister and sees herself kind of like that. In the beginning of this chapter, Earnshaw's wife makes it very clear in a very subtle way her standing in this. That she is not part of the family. She is here to take Kathy's cloak. She's not here to receive her, to welcome her. She's here just to do her job. And Nellie hasn't quite come to terms to that, and I think she never does as she is telling this story. And the way that she's telling the story and the language that she's using is apparent that she hasn't come to terms with this change in society and the change in their dynamics. And you see it once, like I said, with her saying that like Kathy's obviously coming to speak to her old friend, and it's like, is she? And you have to question a lot when you start digging into like that's just like an Pandora's box of questions I have of Nellie's interpretation then, which I am not going to pick at that hornet's nest just yet. The other thing I really like about this chapter is the subtleness, but like harsh divide in Kathy and Heathcliff's relationship, this harsh change that happens. It's subtle because it's not once told to us something's different with the relationship. It is never outright told to us. But every moment in this chapter so far has shown to us that there's a difference in their relationship. That ever since Kathy had spent those weeks with the Lintons, had been forcefully separated from Heathcliff. And she didn't really fight back. She didn't really go, no, no, I don't want to stay here. I want to go with Heathcliff, even if I have a busted ankle. She doesn't do that. She chooses to stay in this kind of image of comfort and paradise that Thrushcross Grange creates in the last chapter. And you see the awkwardness of Heathcliff standing in the shadows when Kathy returns, but Kathy trying to resume what it was, even though she was the one that had chose to separate from him, to leave him almost, you could argue. And she keeps trying to come back, but Heathcliff is keeping his distance because he sees that's not my Kathy, that's someone completely new. And it's similar to anyone that say has spent years apart from a friend. You used to be the closest of people, but then you come back together and all of a sudden they're different and you weren't there for those changes. It's going to be jarring. And Heathcliff is keeping himself distant, whereas because he's processing and this isn't her and he doesn't quite know what to do, and it's not out of respect, it's just out of confusion. And Kathy meanwhile keeps trying to reignite what they once had, not realizing that it's impossible if she wants to be a part of this new world. Like she, just like Nellie, is blind to what she is walking into. There's a lot more you can say here. Nellie then says, in the morning he, meaning Heathcliff, rose early, and as it was a holiday, he carried his ill humor onto the moors, not reappearing till the family were departed for church. Fasting and reflection seemed to have brought him to better spirits. And the reason why I'm talking about this, like, two sentences is the religious aspect. So religion is obviously playing a role in the story. We've seen it since Lockwood in the early chapters of his nightmare with the church and all these things. But we also, Emily Bronte's existing in the time of colonialization, of not only England but other countries reaching out and taking over other countries, converting them to their religions. But that conversion to religions has, been a source of wars and colonialization for centuries. So this isn't a new thing, but the thing, it's almost like we're seeing it on a smaller scale, what's going on globally. Heathcliff representing something other, something different, a different culture, ethnicity, we don't quite know, though I did see a very interesting video theorizing that Heathcliff is the bastard son of old Earnshaw, which would explain some things, but still he would be part whatever his mother was, potentially Romani, potentially African, we don't quite know. But he's not religious as far as we know, and we've seen numerous times, or been told by Nellie that numerous times Kathy and Heathcliff would try to sneak away from their scriptures, that they would fool around, ignore, and they hated it. They often bemoan about having to sit and listen to Joseph. He's not religious, he's not Christian. Him going out to the moors is not him fasting and reflecting in a Christian sense of it, even though he is fasting, like he's avoiding food and he is walking out in the moors, and you can assume reflecting on things. But it's done in a very different manner, but she's putting a Christian spin on it. And it's especially interesting because of the holiday, because it's Christmas. Which, if you look at my Christmas video I just did about for Wuthering Heights, there's a period of time in English history where Christmas was kind of banned because of how it was and the whole paganism aspects of the traditions, and then the overindulgence and Puritans. There's a whole thing that goes on there. Check out the video, I go into that a little bit. But Christmas is typically associated with Christendom, and that's the holiday that they're on, and she's pushing Christendom on Heathcliff, which he's not doing that. He's going out to the moors. He's not going to church with the family. He purposely is avoiding going to church with the family, but goes to the moors, goes to nature, which then adds other layers to this of the fairy aspect of nature versus society, of wildness and things like that. There's so much that you could just pick apart with just Heathcliff and his relationship with the Moors and potentially what that means or represents. Upon returning, Heathcliff says to Nellie, Nellie, make me decent. I'm going to be good. And the word choicing is very interesting. Again, Emily Bronte was a poet prior to writing this book. She is very conscious of her word choices. He doesn't say, make me look decent, make me decent. AKA, you can interpret this as change me. Every layer, not just appearance. Make me decent. I want, I'm going to be good. And this is coming within the same paragraph of Nellie referencing the holiday, Christmas, and him fasting and reflecting, and the family going to church. So, Christendom, make me good, convert me. There's so much going on here, and there's a whole argument that I've been picking apart in these videos and essays I've been writing on the side, and will be filming and posting soon, hopefully, about Kathy and Heathcliff and this bridge between childhood and adulthood and this pressure that they feel from those around them representing society and society's pressure to convert them into being what everyone else is like, to abide by their rules and their standards. And it's Heathcliff saying this is almost as though he is drinking the Kool-Aid. He's starting to believe that that is the proper way to assimilate, that his and Kathy's way is the wrong way, not just a different way. These next couple paragraphs between Heathcliff and Nellie, I think, are very important to the true themes of the book and stuff like that. And it's Nellie saying, High time, Heathcliff. I said, You have grieved Catherine. She's sorry she ever came home. I dare say. It looks as if you envied her because she is more thought of than you. The notion of envying Catherine was incomprehensible to him, but the notion of grieving her he understood clearly enough. Did she say she was grieved? He inquired, looking very serious. She cried when I told her you were off again this morning. Well, I cried last night, he returned, and I had more reason to cry than she. And there's a childishness to this. It's again, they're that weird, awkward stage between childhood and adulthood. And the way that Nellie's talking to him, it's almost like reprimanding a child, like, you grieved her. And believing is out of envy that he's jealous that she's getting more attention, which then, like, now it's like playing a role. That thing I just saw on TikTok of someone thinking that maybe Heathcliff is old Earnshaw's bastard son. So then you have that whole dynamic of her getting more attention than him, but he's like, that's not it at all. Like, he's not ever envious of Kathy. He's not envious of her getting more attention or getting these nicer things and having other friends, which you could argue envious that she has other people in her life, which then takes a completely different direction. This is the brilliance of this. You can go in so many different directions. So on this road, you could talk about him being an abuser, which he does become an actual abuser, but like wanting to have her all to himself, separate her from others, doesn't want her to have other friends and stuff. She is his. He's not quite envious in the way that Nellie's thinking. He's envious because he has to share her. But the other way you can go is that he's not envious. He's grieved because he's seen that she's leaving him behind. There's so many things you can go into, and it actually goes into an essay I'm working on where like he kind of represents childhood, and it's like this envy of like, not envy, grieving of her leaving him, leaving childhood, moving on to adulthood. That is what's happening in this moment. But in addition, she cried when I told her you were off again this morning. And he says, well, I cried last night and I have more reason to cry than she, because what he sees is that I'm still here and she left me and she wants to come back and think everything can be the same when obviously things are not the same. And I think his reflection, and this is, I think, the moment that he is starting down his path of revenge and destruction is because he's being pushed towards this idea of what a gentleman should be like, but he doesn't fit the ideal simultaneously because of his how he looks and his potential race and things like that. And I think he's starting to realize that, like, whatever future or present him and Kathy once have cannot exist in this world thanks to society. There's so much you can unpack with this, and I'm rambling and I hope being coherent, but what I'm trying to get at is the envy and the grieving and the conversation of, like, the way that Nellie's talking to him still feels very childlike and reprimanding a child and talking to a child, but he's thinking on, like, kind of loftier terms. But you also see the grieved, the word grieved. You have grieved Kathy, and in my head, I'm thinking of, like, also mourning, like he's mourning the loss of Kathy. So there's a lot you can dig here, and it's, again, this chapter is the changing point. This is where you can kind of put a pin in and say life before and life after. And we're starting to see the fractures towards the after, the ice breaking. While Nellie is helping Heathcliff look more presentable after his reaction to Kathy's return, they're having this conversation, and there's a lot that goes on in this conversation that I want to dig into. So first off, Nellie is telling him how Kathy was upset previously, and he says, "Did she say she was grieved?" He inquired, looking very serious. "She cried when I told her you were off again this morning." "Well, I cried last night," he returned, "and I had more reason to cry than she." And this is a reminder to the readers of his age, something that even as you're actively reading it, you could still miss, because we can surmise he's probably between 12 to 14, but we don't know definitively his age. We're just told that he's roughly close to Kathy's age in chapter 3 when they're first introduced to each other. But we do know from chapter 6 that Kathy is 12 at this time. And the theme of this particular chapter alone is this, like, microscopic view of that awkward period of time in her life between childhood and adulthood, and trying to act like adult but then still reacting like a child, and being upset when, say, someone in your life is gravitating towards being adult and moving on while and acting differently while you are kind of stuck in the present or the past. It's this whole thing going on, but it's also a reminder that Heathcliff is young. He is young, and at that age, you're full of emotions. You're in the midst of puberty, so even more emotions and hormones and all these things. And simultaneous, so, like, his reaction is natural. It's not uncommon. It's not something we condone, and you try to steer children away from this, because what's also happening here is a very self-centered look, which also is very common for a kid. It's very common for people, and again, you try to steer your kids away from being self-centered and think of others, but he gets trapped in this. He gets trapped in thinking of only his own feelings and not happy, his own wrongs. And we see this with Nellie's response when she says, "Yes, you had the reason to go into bed with a proud heart and an empty stomach. Proud people breathe sad sorrows for themselves." And that first line, you can surmise that she's probably saying sarcastically, like, "Oh, yeah, you had all the reason to go to bed with a proud heart and an empty stomach." Like, oh, yeah, sure, you were had all the reason that you went to bed without dinner, but the only one that suffered really truly was you. But also, proud people breed sad sorrows for themselves. That is one of the major themes of the story. That Heathcliff's downfall, while yes, society and everyone else plays a major role in his situation, he at the end of the day breeds his own sorrows. He is the reason why his life is so miserable, because we watch him make great advancements. He actually does extremely well for himself, but he's not happy because the reason why he's doing it and all the the reason why he's doing it is not for good, but also, like, he's looking to wallow, almost, you could say. And despite, like, it could have been a story of triumph, but instead It's not. It's a story of someone making their own punishment because they want to be punished, that they're so self-centered and wallowing in their own self-pity that of course they're going to be surrounded by sadness because that's all they're looking for in life. And the brilliance of this, and what I think is missing from stories I've read recently that are coming out today, is not all, but a good majority I've read either don't quite have a theme or the theme is too opaque. And I like this. This is a great example to use for writing, is that it's said by someone else that's not experiencing the theme, and it's said in a way that feels very natural for the circumstances here, but we are going to see how he does not take this lesson to heart, and it's going to farther down. Like, we're going to see the future and how future events just get worse, and you see this being played out and not quite learned by him, but at least learned by the next generation. Um, but I really enjoy, like, proud people breathe sad sorrows for themselves, and it's done in a very natural way, like her almost just teaching him a lesson, just saying a saying to him. It's done in a way that does not put a light on the theme, if that makes sense. But that I really enjoyed this, and we're going to continue with more of their. As I just said, we're going to continue with this conversation between Nellie and Heathcliff, with continuing with Nellie's quote, and she says that, "But if you be ashamed of your touchiness, you must cast pardon in mind. When she comes in, you must go up and offer to kiss her and say, 'You know best what to say.' Only do it heartily, and not as if you thought her converted into a stranger by her grand dress." Now, there's more to this quote from Nellie, but we're going to stop here for now, because what she is saying is that if you're ashamed a little bit, which pointing out you should be ashamed, it's a very teaching moment, a very parental moment. She is trying to guide him as best as she can because she is a mother-like figure. She was the oldest one. She is the oldest of this group, this generation of kids. She grew up with them, and she's trying to guide them as best as she can with the circumstances. We have to take in mind that she is technically a servant, so they can very easily ignore her, but also, sometimes you ignore your big sister when she's trying to give advice and you think that you know better, things like that. But she's trying to point out, like, you should be ashamed of your reaction, that you should ask her pardon, which often you do as a little kid, like, ask, say, "I'm sorry," but say it heartily. So it's like, say, "I'm sorry," but mean it. When parents say that to kids, like, mean it. And it's, if you say it like you mean it, you almost convince you, like, almost, it pushes you to genuinely mean it, to genuinely take a step back and realize, like, I am wrong, and realize the other person's situation. And I think that's what she's trying to get at, is like, realize, like, say it heartily, realize, like, you were genuinely wrong, that you were in the wrong. Well, not completely. Like, I understand why he's upset and his feelings, but he's not realizing Kathy's either, and what's going on here, that, you know, not as if you thought her converted to a stranger. He just assumed that the version of Kathy he knew is gone, but she's not. And Nellie witnessed this because while Kathy was acting very poised and elegant, meeting her brother and sister-in-law Nellie, the moment she saw Heathcliff, the old Kathy emerged and ran over, hugged him, and got dirty, which she had tried doing with Nellie. And it's showing that, like, that Kathy still exists, but Heathcliff is so blinded by his own self-wallowing that he doesn't realize that. And she's trying to point this out. But she also says, and say, "You know best what to say," hinting at, Kathy. And this is still that Kathy. Continuing Nellie's quote, she then says, "And now, though I have dinner to get ready, I'll steal time to arrange you so that Edgar Linton shall look quite a doll beside you. And that he does. You are younger, and yet, I'll be bound, you are taller and twice as broad across the shoulders. You can knock him down in a twinkling. Don't you feel that you could?" And she's saying, like, "And now that I have dinner to get ready, I'll steal time to arrange you." So she's saying, like, "Hey, like, I'm busy, but I care for you enough to help you out here. I want you to do well in this world." And again, he is so self caught in himself that he doesn't acknowledge or really thank her for that. He misses this part. He focuses on her saying that he's better than Edgar, that while he is younger, he is taller and twice as broad. Like, you can knock him down, giving a very masculine look to him versus a very feminized style of that time, which this is the late 1700s. Like, that is a style of that time, especially in high society. And the ruggedness would be more akin to the culture that they are existing in the moors. And Heathcliff's face then brightens. He is excited, but then responds with, "But Nellie, if I knocked him down 20 times, that wouldn't make him less handsome or me more so. I wish I'd light hair and a fair skin and was dressed and behaved as well and had a chance of being as rich as he will be." And the funny thing about this is that one, he doesn't acknowledge that if he knocks him down, what would happen to him. That someone like him had knocked someone like Edgar down, the punishment, which is kind of foreshadowing something that will happen later, but in this chapter too. But more so focuses on the physical things, the things that he cannot change himself. That he can knock him down, but that doesn't make him less handsome. That doesn't make his skin fairer. Again, pointing towards him being very possibly a person of color and not as rich. Whereas rich, he could possibly change, but it's a childlike fixation. And again, he's fixating on himself. He's wallowing the self pity. He's breeding his own sorrow. That he's not thinking of the positive, and this is going to affect his future. Once again, the brilliance of Wuthering Heights is the layers to it. Every conversation, every page has 14 layers going on. So, case in point, Nellie is trying to clean Heathcliff up, and she's having a conversation that, like, yes, Edgar might be older, but Heathcliff is taller and broader, and he can knock him down. And Heathcliff responds with, "I could knock him down 20 times over, but he would still be more handsome, like he has light hair and fair skin, well dressed and behaved as well, and had a chance of being as rich as he will be." In which Nellie responds with, "And cried for his mama at every turn, and trembled if a country lad heaved his fist against you, and sat at home all day for a shower of rain." And on like one layer, I'm seeing this from my modern perspective. I'm like, oh, toxic masculinity. But then on another layer, you have what's going on just right here on this page, which is Nellie trying to help Heathcliff. He's in the pit of self-loathing, which is not uncommon for the age that he is. Again, reminder, he's anywhere between the age of 12 to 14. And she's trying to help him and trying to pull him out of that and kind of teach him, like, hey, what did she say previously? Proud people breed sad sorrows. That, like, your self-wallowing is only going to continue to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, pretty much. That look better, you have these benefits that he does not have. And simultaneously, it's a commentary on a thing going on in society at that time, but with two layers to it too, two more layers. So on one layer, it's a commentary of the, like, North versus South, this city versus country. We have Edgar representing Southern metropolitan men of that time who would be made fun of for being foppish, for being too feminine. They're obsessed with their outfits, they're obsessed with, doing certain things, but they cannot, do manly stuff per se. So you have that dichotomy, that arguments going on in the society at that time. And then you also have, Heathcliff representing a country folk, someone who's like, there's no place to wear such fine silks when you are out in the country. Like, you got our outfit, like your silks aren't gonna do well. And even the lords and ladies, often those who have country homes, would change their outfits when they go out there. But like, she's saying that, like, he is so metropolitan that, like, he would not fare well out here, that he is the outsider, not you. And simultaneously saying, like, Kathy is one of us. She is of the North and would obviously be attracted to someone more like you, someone that fits into the beauty ideals of their community, of their culture, which goes into this whole thing of, like, losing their culture because of this kind of colonialization of England. Like, well, they're all in England, but like Southern identity coming up. And I actually came across a TikTok video, and I need to find it and I'll try to like put a link to it where someone from Northern England talks about this layer of Wuthering Heights and how the losing of the culture and things like that, and how they are annoyed with movie adaptations that they don't have someone with their accent or highlight that aspect of the story, which is even within your own country, you can lose your culture. And coming as an American, like it's someone being like coming from more rural parts being upset if, say, you lose that small town culture for more that fast paced city life. Like, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of layers, and just that like little bit of dialogue, you're seeing that here of like what is going on with Nellie and Heathcliff is commenting on so many different things on, the emotions of that age, of the self pitying, of the discussion broadly being had in the society about like, feminized men versus masculinized men, which is still prevalent today, like all these things. And like it's fascinating how it's still relevant to today, and yet we do not focus on it in any of the adaptations. And just to continue, I really enjoyed like Heathcliff and Nellie's comments just remind you again of their age, like something that I would have done and we all would have done at his age. Again, he's between 12 and 14, like where he Nellie's telling him that like the thing that you need to change, you can change, which is your outlook on life. Like, stop frowning, stop sulking, stop suspecting and doubting. Like, look for friends instead of foes everywhere. Like, these are things you can change. And his response is, in other words, I must wish for Edgar Linton's great blue eyes and even forehead. I do, and that won't help me to them. And that is something we've all done, like at that age, that we think that we fixate on something physically about ourselves that we cannot really change. And ignoring, I guess, plastic surgery and all that going on today, but you really shouldn't be able to change those. And that's not the problem. The problem is your outlook, because if you look, you're going to come across people, you're like, they're not that attractive. How are they getting all these people? It's because their outlook and everything about how they move through the world and see life is much more positive, and it draws people towards them more than being negative. I now want to read Nellie's response to Heathcliff because it's very important for a couple arguments. And she says, a good heart will help you to a bonny face, my lad. If you were a regular black, and a bad one would turn the bonniest into something worse than ugly. And now that we've done washing and combing and sulking, tell me whether you don't think yourself rather handsome. I'll tell you I do. You're fit for a prince in disguise. Who knows but your father was Emperor China and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy up with 1 week's income Wuthering Heights and Fresh Cross Grange together. And you were kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England. Were I in your place, I would frame high notions of my birth, and the thoughts of what I should give me courage and dignity to support the oppressions of a little farmer. And this is important because not only is this pointing towards, obviously, that Heathcliff is someone of color, that if you were a regular black and a bad one will turn the bonniest into something worse than ugly. That like if you're a regular black, and especially if you were a bad one, to return, even if you had good looking features, it would make you even uglier. But also, more importantly, you're fit for a prince in disguise. Who knows but your father was an emperor of China and your mother an Indian queen. Obviously, there's something about his features that would give someone the impression that he could be from those regions. There's something about him that would make you go, maybe he's a prince from those regions. So obviously, there's something about him that says that he is not physically like them, that he might be of color, that he might look like he's coming from those regions. But the other thing I want to point out is what she says, which one, the like washing and like things like that, like I kind of hate. Like it almost feels like you're trying to push him towards a specific standard. There probably isn't that. It probably is just like just clean up. But it's like I think there's like prejudice and a racial undertone that you could put here, possibly, of like that you see them just already dirty, and like also like the standard of like how a lot of people of other cultures have to kind of change, for example, their hair to be more like white hair, white people's hair, like stuff like that. But moving on, The thing that I want to also fixate on is her saying that each of them able to buy up a 1 week's income, Wuthering Heights and Fresh Cross Grange together, and you were kidnapped and all these things. It's foreshadowing, very wonderfully and slightly foreshadowing what's going to happen, because I think that is the detail that Heathcliff takes to heart. Not any of these other things, like he's worthy and all these things, that he could be a prince in disguise. Maybe he does kind of put on airs like that a little bit later, but more so, he is going to find the money to be able to buy Wuthering Heights and Fresh Cross Grange. That is, I think he, in a childish way, makes that his goal and thinks in a childish way that will change and fix everything. And in a childish way, does not realize that does not change and fix everything. That those owning those two properties wasn't the solution to the problem, because that wasn't the problem. The problem was his outlook on life. That he could have found happiness if he had changed from within, and not his exterior, not his physical, not his situation per se, but the way that he sees and interacts with the world could have at least made his life marginally better. Not perfect, because society still would have oppressed him, but marginally happier. Nellie and Heathcliff then hear some noise that lets them know that the family has returned, and looks out the window to see that the Lintons are descending from their family carriage, smothered in cloaks and furs, and the Earnshaws dismount from their horses. They often rode to church in winter. And this is letting us know that there is a wealth disparity between the two families. While they are both within the same kind of bracket, they're both landed gentry and have some power and influence over their community, there is a slight difference. It's just the difference is smaller when you compare it to the difference between, say, Kathy and Heathcliff, or Nellie and them. And this is like inferring that, like, the Lintons have enough money to have a carriage, whereas the Earnshaws only have enough to ride horses. And even then, we get the line, they often rode to church in winter, which should infer that they don't often do that. In the other times of the year, they probably more likely walk to church, that the horses probably are needed on the farm, in a very similar situation that we saw in Pride and Prejudice. Remember, there was a line when Jane is asked to go visit the Bingleys, and the mother wants to put them on horseback because the carriage is needed with the farm. Like, there is a very similar situation of the wealth disparity that we saw with the Bingleys versus Bennets. Like, that's kind of what we're seeing here. However, despite the wealth disparity, which should have, according to society, have given more power and influence to the Lintons, we see Kathy has the power and the influence as she takes a hold the hand of each children and bring them into the house and set them before the fire, which quickly puts color to their white faces. She's the one leading them, and we see this also for the rest of their lives, that they are following her, that she is such a force, that despite them having more wealth, she is the one that affects and directs their lives to such an extreme, that she is like I said, she's almost like a black hole that you just kind of get sucked into, that you think it's the sun and then it just bursts and you get sucked into it. That is kind of Catherine's presence. And I like that it's showing this, but it's simultaneously, as we see with this chapter, the awkwardness between childhood and adulthood. And this is another example of it, because Kathy taking the hands of the children, it's Nellie pointing out and calling them children, despite them trying to act like adults, because again, they're between 12 to 15, the three of them, or 11 to 15 between the three of them. And she's trying to be a host, guiding them in, but she takes their hand, which is a very childlike action, that a child would grab another child's hand and lead them in, instead of being like, come with me, like, follow me. Like, it's a very childlike. So we're seeing that awkwardness very subtly, very slowly being shown to us, that it's not in your face, the awkwardness, but with each action and certain word choices, it's being presented to us, and we should be familiar and recognize it. There's another angle that you can look at also with that same sentence, with the Lintons arriving in carriage covered in furs and cloaks, and Kathy leading them in to set them before the fire, which quickly put color to their white faces, which is, they are not native to this region. And because of that, they struggle to survive. Think of it like an animal, like you put an animal that is not native and they struggle and might need more help to survive. It's very similar to that. Whereas Kathy's riding horseback out in the open, cold air and is fine and heartily leading them in. She's more hardy. She grew up on the moors. She's of the moors. She is evolutionarily like kind of set for this hardiness, whereas the Lintons cannot survive in this. They are not native of this. So this is another sly way of showing or leaning into this conversation that Emily Bronte is having. There are many conversations she's having, and one of it is the colonialization that's happening during her time. And it's not just happening abroad, but happening within their country. And it's showing that like sometimes you're not meant for it. Like these people aren't meant for this region. And they just struggle to exist kind of within it. Like there's a conversation being had here with this and with the Lintons and the fact that, you know, they're white faced and that they need to be inside, whereas Kathy was always seen outside on the moors where it's like they're confined within society. You can then have that conversation of the moors representing freedom and wilderness and being out amongst it, whereas, you know, being inside is being within society. Kathy was outside society, now being pulled into society. The Lintons only exist within the society. We don't really see them outside much. So there's a lot of symbolism and conversations being had here. Previously, I mentioned how Kathy grabs each of the Linton children by hand and bring them inside. And there's this like power within her that we're going to see going forward. She is a force that kind of influences everyone's lives. They all kind of bend to her whim, almost, you can say. And she's not guiding them in, and which gives them agency. She's pulling them in, which they want to come in anyway, but it's dictating. And then you see in comparison to how Hindley reacts to the Lintons, because you would assume that the Lintons would have the power and the influence in this situation because of their wealth and how society dictates at the time and even now. But Kathy, however, is the force, whereas Hindley, though, is trying to impress the Lintons when, you know, Heathcliff comes out and Hindley is irritated seeing him clean and cheerful, or perhaps eager to keep his promise to Mrs. Linton, shoved him back with a sudden thrust and angrily bade Joseph keep that fellow out of the room. And it's him trying to impress the Lintons because the Lintons embody not only the Southern metropolitan that society that he had just come from, and his wife possibly is from too, and he's trying to embody it, as we've already seen him changing how his household is being run to emulate closer to the Lintons. So he's trying to impress them and try to be like, I'm like one of you, and uphold his promise to the Lintons. But it also is leaning into, like, as Natalie's pointing out, possibly he just didn't want to seem happy, which there's this whole element here that you can go into where, like, I was just talking about Heathcliff's self-wallowing and pity and all these kind of things, and he doesn't grow out of it. And you would think during those years that Hindley was gone and being cherished by Kathy and Heathcliff, I mean, their father, Heathcliff would have kind of altered his views on life and how he interacts and things, but he doesn't. So I think it was already within him to be kind of Eeyore-ish, I guess you could say. And Hindley, though, just kind of enforces this misbelief that he already kind of has about himself. But also moving forward, we see an element that will be continued throughout this chapter of what is possibly the race, social class, all these kind of things, disparity between Heathcliff and the rest of them, and Kathy being caught in the middle. As you know, Hindley says he'll be cramming his fingers in the tarts and stealing the fruit if left alone with them for a minute, assuming the worst actions from Heathcliff, that he'll ruin things because of who he is very similar to what the Lintons did when they caught him and Kathy out the window, assuming he was part of a robbing gang and saying, wouldn't it be a kindness to the country to kill him now before he could do anything? Like, he hasn't done anything. You're just assuming because of his appearance and his situation that he would do horrible things without anything to back it up to this point. And So we're having a conversation about that, but like I said, we're going to see throughout this chapter this disparity really emphasize and push, and the difference being really kind of pulling the two apart. Heathcliff on one end and everyone else on the other, and Kathy being caught in the middle, having to decide where she's gonna fall. With this next interaction between Heathcliff Henley and Edgar Linton, I'm going to be kind of going almost line by line, getting really into the nitty gritty because there's a lot here to unpack. So it starts first off with Henley saying, "He shall have his share of my hand if I catch him downstairs till dark." Cried Henley. "Begone, you vagabond! What are you attempting to coxcomb? Are you? Wait till I get a hold of those elegant locks. See if I won't pull them a bit longer." To define what a coxcomb is pretty much like a vain, conceited man. It's often used with dandies, or if you're American, you might know the rhyme, like, Yankee Doodle went to town, he stuck a feather in his head, the macaroni. Like, macaroni was like another term for a dandy, for a foppish man, for someone that really thought about style. And this was a discourse around the 1700s and 1800s. So you saw it in the Georgian and Regency eras of defining what a man is. And it's very funny that it was a discourse then and still a discourse today of like what would be defined as a man, because you had the ones that would be a little bit more rugged, kind of dirty, and then you had the ones that are very aware of style and how many fobs do they wear, and all of these kind of like, the cut of their pants. And like, you see it made fun of, for instance, in the old show from BBC, Blackadder. There's a season with the Prince Regent, played by Hugh Laurie, and like him being more obsessed about his pants, and look at these fine pants. And you see it presented in, for example, in the 2020 version of Emma, like very subtly you can see that. I am blanking on his name. I cannot remember who the other potential love interest is, but like him compared to Mr. Knightley, like his clothes, you can see there's a difference in quality, and that's because he was more focused on being stylish. And even like, it's brought up in Evelina by Frances Burney. You see characters who almost, the guys stand there almost like they're poisoned, like dancers. And Georgette Hara in her Regency novels, they are just littered with such men. And even like the ones that are kind of stylized but aren't obsessed like others. So it's a very interesting kind of like subgrouping to like really dig into, and I'm very fascinated by, obviously. But the reason why this is ironic to me is that Hindley was someone that had come from at least a little bit further south to go to school. He's implementing some more Southern metropolitan ideas and thoughts, as we're seeing as he changes the household. The Lintons are more like that. So, like, Edgar and Hindley would be more likely to probably be more like coxcombs and dandies than Heathcliff. Heathcliff's just trying to clean himself up. Heathcliff, from the way that we've been presented him, would probably be more the rugged man, like version of a man that would be common of this region that they're coming from. So it's like I said, it's just ironic that it's coming from Edgar and Hindley, who would be more likely to lean into this dandyism than Heathcliff, but yet they're calling him out in this moment. Continuing on with Hindley having said that, like, wait till I get a hold of those elegant locks, see if I won't pull them a bit longer. "They're long enough already," observed Master Linton, peeping from the doorway. "I wonder they don't make his head ache is like a colt's mane over his eyes." And this little moment from Edgar Linton tells us a lot about him as a person. First off, he's comparing him to a horse, to an animal, which is, putting him on the level of an animal. But the thing that I want to focus on more is his comment being very a childlike comment. Like, this is like his, what he's saying feels more like we would hear a child say. And he is a child. We have to remember that. But him jumping in after Hindley's been picking on him tells us a lot. That he feels comfortable to bully someone else, to belittle someone else. However, he is not an aggressor, if that makes sense. Like, and we're going to see this going forward, like, he doesn't start things and even continue if it's just him. He only feels comfortable if he has a crowd, if he has the backing of his placement and his society and those rules supporting him and others supporting him. If he's standing alone, he will back down immediately. And Heathcliff, according to Nellie, is a little bit bigger than him, so of course, like, he would be a little afraid. And as we're seeing, like, he's saying this from the doorway, as though, like, if Heathcliff lunges for him, he's gonna run. Like, he's not gonna be in any reaching distance of Heathcliff, as he says this. But it's also kind of showing us how very easily it is for people to jump on and believe certain rhetoric, to lean into these beliefs. Like, Edgar is seeing someone who is older than him, someone who is not as old as his parents, so he might look up and be like, Hindley's cool, and look at him and pick on Heathcliff, and I want to impress Hindley. I'm going to jump in on this. And then you justify yourself. You go, well, of course I would make fun of him. Like, have you seen him? Like, he's nobody. And you start internalizing these beliefs. And that's where it starts getting worse. So just this line and description tells us a lot about Edgar as a person. Not that he can't change. However, it seems that, and he does slightly, I think, when he marries Kathy, but he is not pushed to change enough. Instead, she's pushed to change. Following Edgar Linton's comment about Heathcliff, Nellie then says, he ventured this remark without any intention to insult, but Heathcliff's violent nature was not prepared to endure the appearance of impertinence from one who he seemed to hate, even then as a rival. This is a moment where we have to remember Nellie selling this tale. Nellie, who has been working for almost 20 years now under Edgar Linton, he has been her master, and she is a very loyal person. Of course, she's going to paint Edgar in a better light. Going to say that, oh, he was just making it a comment. He wasn't trying to make fun of him. He wasn't trying to bully him. The violent one, the mean one in this situation is Heathcliff. Look at, even though she's trying to explain to Lockwood Heathcliff, there are many moments in which she then leans on this perception, this idea of him because of where he was born, his race, all these other aspects that, of course, he would be violent. It's within his nature to be violent. And, of course, Edgar wouldn't be even cruel because of who he is in society, his standing in society. And this is one of those moments where you can see Nellie as the narrator trying to lead our impressions of these two characters. But when you isolate it, you go, that doesn't seem like the case. Though Heathcliff reacts physically, that's because he has never been given the space to harm someone with his words, if that makes sense. And he's always been like harmed physically. Like, Joseph's going to harm him physically. He has never harmed him with his words. Whereas, like, Edgar and Hindley have probably had many instances in which they were harmed by words, so they use words against others. And so there's a lot to unpack just here. In his fit of anger, Heathcliff reaches for hot applesauce and throws it at Edgar Linton. When he starts crying, it brings Isabel and Catherine to the room. Mr. Earnshaw, aka Hindley, snatched up the culprit directly and conveyed him to his chamber, where doubtless he administered a rough remedy to cool the fit of passion, for he appeared red and breathless. And again, we're seeing Nellie trying to almost gaslight us, but recontextualize how the situation went. And you see it with her saying, where doubtless he administered a rough remedy to cool the fit of passion. Instead of saying he went upstairs and beat the shit out of Heathcliff, or he went upstairs and beat Heathcliff as punishment, she tries to word it to then put the blame not only on Heathcliff that, Hindley had to beat him, but also put it in a way that doesn't sound as violent, that it's a rough remedy. Doesn't sound as violent as a beating. And again, we're seeing Nellie, the way that she's contextualizing it, which is very human. It's done sometimes subconsciously, we do this. And I like that Emily Bronte is showing this. So as Hindley is administering his rough remedy to cool his temper, aka beating Heathcliff, Kathy turns to Edgar as Isabella was crying, and she stood by confounded, blushing for all. You should not have spoken to him, she expostulated with Master Linton. He was in bad temper, and now you're spoiled your visit. He'll be flogged. I hate him to be flogged. I can't eat my dinner. Why did you speak to him, Edgar? And this is the first moment that Kathy is being tested. As I mentioned early in the chapter, her return from her stay with the Lintons, she has emerged as a young lady. She's on the cusp of puberty. She now has to decide, do I revert back to my childhood self, which has a lot more freedoms, and I'm with Heathcliff, or do I step into adulthood? And by stepping into adulthood means I have to now enter society and enter with their rules and standards, which means I have to leave Heathcliff behind and a lot of other aspects about myself behind. And this is a moment where she's standing there in this moment of debate because she doesn't quite know which way to lean. That's why she's confounded and she's blushing because she's upset for both and uncertain. But yet, because Heathcliff's not in the room, she turns and confronts Edgar and almost is blaming him for putting her in a situation that, he shouldn't have talked to Heathcliff, that he's going to be flogged and now I can't eat dinner. Like, you are causing me now pain, which is one, showing her loyalty, which is great, but it's also putting blame on someone else, even though it's rightfully putting blame on him because, he does have more power. Just speaking to him is now causing Heathcliff to have physical punishment. You have a little hot applesauce on you, you'd be fine. It wasn't even that hot. Like, he's being flogged right now. But what's worse is Edgar's response. He says, I didn't, sobbed the youth, escaping from my hands and then finishing the remainder of the purification with his cambric pocket handkerchief. I promised Mama that I wouldn't say one word to him, and I didn't. And we know he did. And it's a very childish response. Like, that is not uncommon that for a kid to lie in a way like this when put in a situation. But it's showing us him that he won't own up to what he did, own up that, like, he doesn't quite have a backbone, I guess you could say. Like, he doesn't own, like, up and say, of course I would call him out. Like, who is he? Like, he's nothing to us. Like, he doesn't say anything like that, though he probably internally believes it, but he follows the whims of whoever's the powerful force in the room at the time. So Hanley's picking on him. He's going to lean into that. Kathy's now yelling at him. He's got to appease Kathy. And I don't think it's done out of love. I think it's just Kathy is such a force. We've seen this from Nellie's description of Kathy very early on, of her describing her as a child whose emotions influenced everyone else in the room. If she was upset, everyone had to be upset with her. If she was happy, everyone was happy. And we're seeing Kathy saying, like, I'm upset, I won't be able to eat, and Heathcliff, Edgar's trying to remedy this. And it could be just that maybe something in his own life has caused him to be such a people pleaser, to appease his parents, maybe to avoid having any emotion, too much emotions, which would fit within the society standard that he lives in, with, like, you don't want to be too emotional. And that's what they're pushing Kathy away from, being too emotional. But also that there's something about Kathy that she is such a force, that she's, like I've described, a black hole. And there's something about her that he's now backbending to appease her, to a point that he will lie, being like, no, I didn't talk to him. But it simultaneously is him, even if he may not be aware, or he could be aware, is trying to paint Heathcliff in a worse light, being like, no, I didn't even talk to him. He just attacked me for no reason. So there's a lot you can unpack here. I do like how Kathy calls Edgar and Isabella out for being too soft. And she's like, well, you're not killed. Don't make more mischief. Like, stop crying. Stop making a big thing. Like, my brother is coming. Be quiet. Because she knows that, like, if he continues to cry and makes a bigger deal of it, then Hindley will make a bigger deal with Heathcliff. And she's calling, Edgar out, and also being like, fuck up. Like, come on, knock it off. And even Isabella, like, stop your crying. No one hurt you. Like, why are you upset? And we're seeing, like, the differences of, like, their upbringings to being presented here, and her calling them out, being like, no, you don't cry. And I think it's because, like, she was told to curb her emotions, that she had too much emotions, that she needed to be calmer. but yet it's seeing these tunes like, why is no one curbing your emotions? She's mirroring what the adults have been doing to her to these guys too. But it's weird that they're allowed to be like this, but she's not allowed to be as strong emotioned as she had been. I mentioned during this chapter, and I've also mentioned in the Christmas video, how this chapter is showing really beautifully this awkward transition from childhood into adulthood. How you try to act like an adult with Kathy, staying up late to make preparations for her friends to come, acting like the hostess and the lady of the house. How you try to act like an adult, but then you have moments like this where like they're blubbering like a child, Edgar and Isabella, and then even having Hindley come down, going, there, children, to your seats. It's I brought this up in the Christmas video I made, and it's on YouTube and stuff, but the awkwardness of like you're trying to act like an adult and Nellie humoring and thinking it's cute, but then you have someone like Hindley being like, all right, children, remind you that you're still young. Like it's interesting. Like, Hindley in the beginning of the chapter just called Kathy a young lady. But now it's like, all right, children, to your seats. And it's probably because they're all crying like children, but and acting like children in this instance. But it's this awkwardness, like you're trying to be an adult, but then being reminded you're just a kid and you don't have power in this situation. And that's what's going on here. Like Kathy doesn't quite have power in this situation, not only because of her gender, but because of her age. While she's being treated like a young lady, she's being commanded how to act and how to feel in this moment by her brother. We then have Hindley saying, like, besides other children to your seats, the brood of the lad has warned me nicely. Next time, Master Edgar, take the law into your own fists. I will give you an appetite. And I hate it's not uncommon to see phrasing like this, and it's so I hate it. It's like, well, I warned me nicely. Now I have an appetite. And it's also encouraging Edgar to be violent. And it's this continuation. Like, it's fine to beat up Heathcliff. It's within our rights, and you should take the law in your own hand, Master Edgar. Like, we don't see Edgar ever doing this in the future, which is kind of nice, but that's just because of him as a person would probably never do this. But we're seeing this continuation of violence, this encouraging of this continuation of violence from Hindley. Following the scene in which Hindley banished and beats Heathcliff, he leads Kathy, Isabella, and Edgar into dinner, and Nellie notes how dinner reaches like a point of equanimity, that like they are lively again, that his wife does a good job of making lively conversations, that like it shows she's a good hostess in accordance to society standard at that point. And Nellie also notes how, she was pained to behold Catherine with dry eyes and an indifferent air commence cutting up the wing of a goose before her. An unfeeling child, I thought to myself, how lightly she dismisses her old playmate's trouble. I could not have imagined her to be so selfish. It's pointing out that, like, as a woman, there's no winning. There is no winning as a woman. She is doing exactly what she is expected to do as a young lady. You're supposed to have a control of your emotions, something that she has been ridiculed for having an exuberant amount of emotions, that she shows it too much too freely, that when she emerges back from her time at the Lintons, the one of the things that they note is her control of emotions, her calmness. And that's something that they want in a young lady of this standing in society. They would want something like that, to have a situation like that and then act like it was fine. But Nellie's then going, how unfeeling of her to not feel upset about her playmate. Like, she can't show it. She's not allowed to show it according to society standards. However, the line then continues when she says she lifted a mouthful to her lips, then she set it down again. Her cheeks flushed and the tears gushed over them. She slipped her fork to the floor and hastily dived under the cloth to conceal her emotions. I did not call her unfeeling long, for I perceived she was in purgatory throughout the day and worrying to find an opportunity of getting by herself or paying a visit to Heathcliff, who had been locked up by the master, as I discovered on endeavoring to introduce him a private mess of victuals. Kathy is grieving, but she's not allowed to show it. And we see this change in her. Like, I have to wonder what changed in her, because as Nellie said, when she was a child, everyone felt her emotions. When she was upset, everyone had to be upset with her. not well, they were upset with her, but everyone had to equally be not happy alongside her. But yet she is trying to hide her tears and dive under the table to hide it. And like it's so heartbreaking because this is in the moment again showing this awkwardness between childhood and adulthood. She's trying to act like an adult, but she still is a child and has not quite captured containing her emotions. But at the same time, she should be able to feel this freely. She should be able to say out loud that wasn't fair, but she can't. And it's sad that she realized that she can't, and that exuberance, like it's Kathy is such a hard thing to pin down because a part of you are like you shouldn't be too exuberant, but then at the same time she should be free to have her feelings. And it's we're still existing in a society that is controlling of our emotions, both male and female, and it's hard for myself not to be like, okay, too much emotions from her, but at the same time being like she should be able to freely show that she's upset with the situation. But at the same time, like if I was at the dinner, be like, she should not be crying at this dinner. Like it's hard because even, you know, 200 years later from this book being written, we're still suffering in a similar beliefs of emotions. And like I said, there's no winning. It's hard for her, and it's showing that she does feel for Heathcliff and is worried, but something has changed where she feels powerless to change his situation. Like she cannot do anything to change it, but instead just try to be like, let's just avoid Hindley's and others' attention. It's much safer that way. Why would you call attention Edgar? In that conversation she had. I'm rambling a little bit, but like this is, I think, a very important conversation. And there's something that happened in those 4 weeks with the Lintons that I am wondering what happened to kind of crush and contain that spirit of her. It's still present in some cases, especially the more time she spends with Heathcliff, it reemerges. But what happened to diminish it so much? The evening then continues with dancing, and Kathy begs to free Heathcliff because Isabella doesn't have a partner and is denied. And there's something about that like her asking, I don't know, I kind of got the sense I might be wrong, but I got the sense that her as a child would do something and ask for forgiveness instead of asking permission. And like the way that she would wittily snap back at her father when he was like, why can you not be a good child? And she's like, why can you not be a good father? Like there's that part of her is not that present right here. And it's interesting that she's now feels the pressures to appease those older and higher in society and play by their rules, which is a good thing. But it's just interesting this almost sudden change it feels like in her, and to ask permission and stuff and try to play by the rules to then free Heathcliff and then still be denied. But the other thing I want to point out with this is Nellie's wording. She says, we got rid of all the gloom and the excitement of the exercise, and our pleasure was increased by the arrival of the Gimmerton band. It's the gloom. Like the way that she words it makes it feel like she could not be more relieved to forget Heathcliff's circumstances and move on to have a merry Christmas evening. Because remember, this is Christmas, but simultaneously was ridiculing Kathy for acting as though she has moved on previously during the dinner. So Nellie, I love that she's so flawed in this, that this feels like a very human kind of response at like critiquing someone else but not yourself. But also like I don't know, like if she assumed Kathy as someone higher status had more power to help Heathcliff than she did. Which yeah and no, because there's the age discrepancy, there's a lot of other things, but like neither lady did anything to really change what's going on for him, nor are they capable of changing anything. But like Nellie at the same time had capabilities. Like she, I don't know, she does need to serve and be around and be present, but at the same time she could have done something to like help Heathcliff, and she didn't. Like I don't know. It's it's a tough situation that they are both put in thanks to the environment and society and the rules that they are existing in. And I like that Emily Bronte is trying to show this, that like because of what society dictates, these two women are powerless, but then ridiculed for being powerless and not helping him. But like, what could they do per se? Like, there's a lot you can unpack with just that. I also talk about the band going around in the Christmas at Wuthering Heights video I posted, and I talk about it because of this time. Charity was a big part of the Christmas times like tradition, but it's also you saw what were acceptable things to be charitable towards. And we're seeing it being demonstrated here that like it's acceptable to be charitable towards this band who are probably a slightly lower class and give money to them, but not be charitable towards Heathcliff, which you don't even need to give money towards. You just allow him to be part of the merriment. But no, something about having a brief moment of you being entertained by a band, you're willing to give money, but instead of doing something for free, which is just incorporate someone into your merriment and have them in your orbit. And it's this hypocrisy that I think Emily Bronte is kind of like talking about. It's like, why do we put lines and definitions on what is acceptable to be charitable towards and what's not? And you see it also kind of being demonstrated very slightly by like what Nellie says how it used to be with old Mr. Earnshaw and how he used to invite all of them into the merriment and be charitable towards all of them. But now it's not there. Like it's different. It's changed, and it's that change for the better. As the traveling performers are playing, Kathy claims that the music sounds the sweetest at the top of the stairs to Nellie, and it feels like such a childlike claim that that was the spot that she probably would have to sit because she wasn't invited previously to come down with the other adults. However, it's actually a front for her to then go talk to Heathcliff, which Nellie allows to happen until the music is dying down and she goes to warn them, but discovers that Kathy, the little monkey, had crept by the skylight of one garret along the roof into the skylight of the other. It was with the utmost difficulty I could coax her out again. And to me, it's representing that being within this house is oppressive, it's suffocating. The house representing society and the pressures within it. And Kathy and Heathcliff escape to nature, even if it just means standing on the roof. That they're at least outside in nature. And that is when they are the truest selves, is when they're within nature, nature being unclaimed, untouched, untamed by man. And like I'm part of my essay I'm working on is that Heathcliff represents the Moors and being that aspect of it of being untamed. There's more to it that I'm getting into in my essay, but in this specific moment though, I'm also when I read it, I thought of Jane Eyre, which I think there's a lot of similarities between the three sisters' works, and we should really focus on it because it probably tells us a lot more because of them all growing up within the same household during the same time. So there's something that they're all trying to say. And the thing that this moment reminded me of in Jane Eyre is when Mr. Rochester's first wife, the mad wife in the attic, burns the house and jumps from the top of the building. And there's so much symbolism that one could claim of like the oppression of the society had made her mad, that she jumps to freedom, that it's coming from the top of the building. What does that represent? There's so much you could probably pick at, and I probably just write an entire essay just on that detail. But for now, not to bog you down with it, I want you to think about it. I want to invite you to think, could this potentially, could there potentially be something here? Why is Emily Bronte having the two of them have this moment on the roof, on the garret of like, it's a hard place to sit, of Wuthering Heights outside in the middle of winter. She could have them have their conversation and sitting amongst each other. They could have been sitting in that window seat that Lockwood had fallen asleep in, but no, they're outside. So why did she choose to have them sitting there? When Nellie is finally able to get Kathy to come inside, she also brings Heathcliff and asks Nellie to bring Heathcliff downstairs to feed him and put him in the kitchen for warmth and stuff, especially since Joseph had gone to the neighbors to avoid pretty much the devil's music and all these things. He's very, very strongly religious. But at first, Nellie says she's not going to abide by their tricks and their pranks. But then Winks and Erase bring Heathcliff downstairs, and it's, I think, showing the fluidity of Nellie's morality, that she doesn't want to play into their tricks, but then agrees that like it should, that she is struggling to adhere to what she's expected per her station, with Hindley being the master, but then simultaneously wanting to give human comfort to Heathcliff, treat him like a human because she sees him as a human for the most part. And it's the mirror then how she treats Kathy, but Kathy's in an even worse position because in the previous scene we saw how she was ridiculing Kathy for being so cold against her friend who was just punished. How dare she? Until she started crying and dove under the table to hide it. And it's showing the hard line that Kathy's expected to walk, that she's expected to be, not only wants her to act the way that like a young lady of her standing in society is supposed to act, but then simultaneously be, you know, have charity and kindness and all these things. But like Kathy is 12 and walking that fine line, because it's a fine line to appease society while simultaneously showing human courtesy, because sometimes it doesn't overlap, is a really hard thing for a 12-year-old to do. It's a hard thing for us to do today. It's something that's expected of women today, to walk an extremely fine line, that we're supposed to be strong women, but simultaneously be like have men be able to take care of us, and then simultaneously like be emotionless but be sounding boards for other people's emotions. Like there's so many contradictory things that we're supposed to do. Like we're supposed to be sexy but not too sexy, that whole thing. And it's a very fine line that no one can walk, and that's what Kathy's facing right now. And even Nellie, but Nellie to a lesser extreme, because she's not in the light as much as Kathy is, thanks to Kathy's position. This brief interlude with Nellie and Lockwood at the end of this chapter highlights and emphasizes a couple of the themes of Wuthering Heights, and these themes revolving around class, the cultural colonialization of the South coming into the North, which like I can link down below a couple TikTok creators I came across that are from the northern region, from the regions that the story takes place, that can go into this with more detail and personal experience, because that is very much true. We cannot discourage the culture of that region that was being lost and overthrown at this time and even to the present day. But getting back into this is also going into how we view others, because Locke was trying to encourage Nellie to keep telling her tale, and she's like, it's 11 o'clock. And he's like, this is early for someone like me. Like, I would be up for hours. Even one or two is early enough for a person who lies in at 10. And Nellie says, you shouldn't lie in till 10. There's the very prime of the morning gone long before that time. A person who has not done one half his day's work by 10 o'clock runs a chance of leaving the other half undone. And it's showing like he's coming from Southern Metropolitan. Like he has this luxury that he can lie in till 10 and stay out all night partying and stuff. Like these are the type of people we're more familiar with in story, like the Regency romance stories. Like think of Bridgerton, think of Georgia O'Hara. Those are the characters, like those landed gentry could stay up late and go out late and stuff like that. But Nellie's from the country, and not only that, Nellie's a servant. Like you better be up at dawn working, because you're not only catching the light, but you have a lot of work to do. And Nellie specifically has work to do in this house, and you're asking her to stay up and sacrifice her own sleep for your own entertainment. But then you get the awkward situation where like Nellie is being paid for him by him to technically serve him, be a servant. Like her job is to do, it's like it's a weird kind of like do what he wants, but then it's getting into a weird sexual part, which I'm not trying to do. But like if he wants her to entertain, like she kind of is in a weird position where she can't quite say no. She has to skirt around and pretty much point out like I have a lot of other things that I'm being paid by you to do first thing in the morning. Like there are other tasks that I have to do to make sure this household is running, and not kind of being courteous of other people's time and work and things like that, which at the same time, like, I'm not frowning on Lockwood because we would probably do something like that too, because in the moment you think very much of like, I wanna hear the story, I wanna hear the rest, not realizing, like, for a moment what this other person's life is like. If that makes sense. I'm rambling a little bit here, but, like, I wanted to point out that Emily Bronte is purposely telling us this, that Lockwood is, like, an alien to Nellie, and Nellie is an alien to him, that, like, they live very different lifestyles, they have very different cultures, and you have this weird dynamic now of, like, which one's right? Like, someone who's coming in, the outsider, would you adjust your life around their schedule, or should they adjust their life to yours? It's a weird thing. As a visitor, Lockwood is able to kind of notice certain details of this community more so than, like, the Lintons who are inhabitants, even though the Lintons are more similar to Lockwood than, say, like, the Earnshaws would have been, and he at least, though, he's noticing some details, but it's kind of like it feels like it's an observer kind of looking down, which would have been very of this time period that Emily Bronte is writing, like, people colonializing and people going to other, you know, countries, and the way that they describe them is very, like, almost academic and as others. But I feel like he's at the heart of the people of the Moors in this community when he says that um they do live more in earnest, more in themselves, and less in surface change and frivolous external things. I could fancy a love for a life here almost possible, and I was a fixed unbeliever in any love of the or standing. And so what is pointing out is a cultural difference between himself and the community he's existing in right now of Wuthering Heights and Morse. That he's coming from a community that is superficial, frivolous, and moving. Like, you cannot stand still, you're not staying in one place. You almost don't quite have a home because you're just moving so much. Whereas the people here are earnest and slower, and he almost could love it, but at the same time, like, he's admiring them for their differences, like the certain differences because of him recently being burned and embarrassed, and that's what led him here. But at the same time, he's not willing to change other aspects of himself, like going to bed early, waking up early. Like, what he's missing is that the culture is very much intertwined with the people and how they act, which is very much entwined with their environment, which gets into a very eco-critical style of thinking. And, like, I'm not super familiar with the style of thinking. I just recently read a couple essays, so tying it with, like, Wuthering Heights and the Moors. And one area of thinking is that the nature you grow up in influences you as a person, very much like nature versus nurture kind of aspect, but in the sense that, like, the people of the Moors, the way that you might describe them very much mirrors how you would describe the nature itself on the Moors, that they're patient and steadfast. And there's this beautiful speech I read tying the people of the Moors and Wuthering Heights and how Emily Bronte had perfectly captured it. And I think it's a showing that, like, the environment that you're living in, and not just, like, the man-made environment, but the natural environment influences a person's personality and outlook and thoughts and all these other things. And that's what he's kind of missing, is that you kind of have to be tied to the nature, and in the sense you then would have to change how you act and wake up and do all these other things. As I just said, the way that Lockwood was just speaking feels very academic and very distant and almost looking down, and Nellie picks up on it when she says, "Oh, here we are the same as anywhere else. When you get to know us," observed Mrs. Dean, somewhat puzzled at my speech. "Excuse me," I responded. "You, my good friend, are striking evidence against that assertion. Expecting a few provincialisms of slight consequence, you have no mark of the manners which I have inhabited to consider as peculiar to your class. I am sure you have a great deal more than generality of servants think. You have been compelled to cultivate your reflective faculties for want of occasion for frittering your life away in silly trifles." Mrs. Dean says that she has read many books within this Lockwood, not Lockwood. the Grange's library and all these things, like she's well read. And so it's this conversation beautifully also then digs into the class difference and assumptions based off class and also culture. But like Ellie Jean's pretty much trying to point out like we're all humans, we're all the same, we all have a lot of the same basic desired needs, wants. And he's like, oh well, you're the exception to the general belief of your class, of your servant class. And she's like, it's funny because then she digs down. It's like, well, I'm well read, and it's like she's trying to elevate herself to be of an equal standing with him and the others, like Kathy and stuff, which is very awkward because she did grow up alongside them, treated them like younger siblings, like she's the big sister, or mothering and things like that. So she's in this awkward position where, like, technically she's supposed to be below them and slightly less educated, but raised a little different. And so she thinks that, like, we're all the same, aren't we? And it's the exceptionalism, like, kind of, it once again reminds me of Ballads on Versus Snakes by Suzanne Collins, in which Snow's like, well, Lucy's not district. Like, yeah, she lives in the districts, but she's not quite district. She's the exception. And it's okay then for us to interact. And that's kind of what we're seeing here, that like he's trying to justify that Nellie's okay, but my beliefs of the serving class still stand too, instead of changing his beliefs that of other people and seeing them just as people, and the circumstances that they exist in as society puts them then at these disadvantages. Like, there's this whole thing that you can unpack with just this bit. With that, that is the end of chapter 7.